The file does not begin with a weapon you can see. There is no gun, no missile, and no explosion. The file begins with silence. It begins in a room where the air feels heavy, and the only sound is the rhythmic scratching of a pen on paper and the low, barely audible hum of the electrical grid. For decades, the people inside this room believed they were safe. They believed the thick concrete walls and the diplomatic seals on the doors protected them from the enemy outside. They were wrong while they slept, while they ate, and while they drafted treaties to prevent nuclear war. They were being bathed in an invisible light. It was a light the human eye could not register, but the human body absorbed it, day after day, year after year. It moved through the glass windows as if they weren't there. It moved through the skin, vibrating the cells, heating the blood by a fraction of a degree, not enough to burn, but enough to change things. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a matter of record, buried for decades under the stamp of top secret, in the deepest archives of the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency. There exists a timeline of an event that has no official name, but in the corridors of intelligence, it is known simply as the signal. It was an act of war that never triggered a battle. It was a biological experiment conducted on unwitting Americans, not by the enemy, but allowed to continue by their own leaders. The data was collected, the medical charts were drawn, and the file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The year is 1953. The location is Moscow. The atmosphere is frozen, both in the air and in the politics of the world. Imagine the sound of snow crunching under heavy boots on a quiet street. The city is grey, built of stone and steel, recovering from one war and preparing for another. High above the street, in the upper floors of the U.S. Embassy on Makovaya Street, the lights are still on. Inside, the air is stale, smelling of cigarette smoke, hot coffee, and the ozone scent of warm electronics. It is a fortress of bureaucracy. But tonight, the routine is broken. Tonight, the silence of the embassy is interrupted not by a voice, but by a needle on a gauge, twitching violently into the red. This is the story of the day. The background noise stopped being noise, and became a weapon. To understand the anomaly, we must first understand the environment. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the early 1950s was an island. It was a 10-story building surrounded by an ocean of hostile territory. Every phone line was monitored. Every local staff member, the janitors, the drivers, the cooks, was assumed to be reporting to the KGB. The American diplomats lived in a state of constant low-level paranoia. They knew they were being watched. They accepted it as the cost of doing business. But surveillance usually implies passivity. A spy watches. A microphone listens. These are passive acts. The assumption was that if you said nothing secret, you were safe. In 1953, a team of security technicians arrived from Washington. Their job was routine, a technical surveillance countermeasures sweep. In the trade, this is called debugging. They brought with them heavy vacuum tube equipment, oscilloscopes, field strength meters, and wideband receivers. Their goal was to find the hidden microphones that Soviet intelligence was famous for planting in the plaster of the walls or the wood of the desks. They began on the upper floors. In the Chancellor's office, this was the nerve center of the embassy, the place where the most sensitive conversations happened. The technicians moved slowly, waving their wands over the bookshelves, the curtains, the heavy oak desk. They listened to the static on their headphones, waiting for the telltale feedback screech of a hidden transmitter for hours. There was nothing. Just the standard electromagnetic hum of a city waking up, the 50-cycle hum of the electrical wiring, the faint crackle of distant radio stations. Then, they moved near the window. The audio in their headphones changed. It wasn't the sharp whine of a microphone. It was a broad, pulsating thrum, a rhythmic, electronic washing sound. The needle on the field strength meter jumped. The technician stepped back. The needle dropped. He stepped forward, toward the glass. The needle spiked again. That it wasn't coming from inside the room. It wasn't a bug planted in the wall. The signal was coming from outside, pushing through the window with surprising intensity. They checked the frequency. It was nowhere near the standard radio bands used for news or military communications. It was sitting in the microwave spectrum, specifically, between 2.5 and 4.0 GHz. In 1953, this was a strange place to find a signal. This was the realm of radar, of advanced navigation systems, not casual communication. The technicians were puzzled. They adjusted the gain on their receivers. They tried to demodulate the signal, to see if it carried audio or voice, a code, a teletype stream. But there was no modulation. There was no information. It was just a carrier wave, a pure, focused beam of energy that they moved to the next window. The signal was there. They moved to the floor below. The signal was weaker. They moved to the roof. The signal was scattered. They triangulated the source. They pointed their directional antennas out the window, sweeping the horizon of the Moscow skyline. The signal grew loudest when they pointed their equipment directly at a specific beige apartment building across the street on the western side. The technicians stood in the cold draft of the window, looking at the building. It looked like any other residential block in Soviet Moscow. Gray concrete, small balconies, laundry hanging on lines. But on one specific balcony, obscured by wooden slats, something was running. Something was generating enough power to flood the Chancellor's office with microwaves 24 hours a day. This was the first anomaly. Why would the Soviet Union blast the embassy with a meaningless signal? If it was a jamming signal, designed to block American radios, it was directed at the wrong target. It was hitting the offices, not the antennas on the roof. If it was a listening device, it was using a technology that didn't make sense to the American engineers at the time. The technicians logged the incident. They wrote down the frequency, 2.5 GHz. They wrote down the estimated power density, 5 microwatts per square centimeter. They labeled it the Moscow signal. They assumed it was a temporary glitch. Perhaps a Soviet radar test gone wrong. Perhaps a new piece of industrial equipment in the apartment building. They filed the report, packed their equipment, and prepared to leave. But the signal didn't stop. A week passed. The technicians checked again. The beam was still there. A month passed. The beam was still there. It was steady. It was constant. It was bathing the diplomats in a continuous stream of electromagnetic energy. This is where the story shifts from a technical curiosity to a medical mystery. In 1953, the understanding of microwaves was in its infancy. We knew they could generate heat. Radar operators in the Navy had noticed that chocolate bars melted in their pockets when they stood too close to the active dishes. We knew that at high enough power, microwaves could cook biological tissue. But the Moscow signal was strange. It wasn't powerful enough to cook. It was what scientists call a thermo. It didn't raise the body temperature significantly. So, by the crude safety standards of the 1950s, it was technically safe. However, looking back through the lens of modern archival data, we see the first cracks in that assumption. The technicians noted that after spending hours in the signal path near the windows, they felt a strange pressure in their temples, a dullness, a fatigue that coffee couldn't fix. One technician noted in a classified memo which would not be declassified for 40 years that the air in the Chancellor's office felt electrically charged, and that his ability to concentrate on complex diagrams seemed to evaporate when the signal was at its peak intensity. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing inside a petri dish. The question that began to circulate in the closed rooms of Washington was not, how do we stop it, but what is it doing? Was it a weapon? Was it a tool? Or was it something far more sinister, key to unlock the human mind? To answer this, the American government did something extraordinary. They did not file a formal protest. They did not demand the Soviets turn it off. They did not install shielding to protect their staff. Instead, they decided to watch. The decision was made at the highest levels of the State Department. If the Soviets were running an experiment, the United States wanted to see the results. But to see the results, the experiment had to continue. The subjects of the experiment, the ambassadors, the secretaries, the cipher clerks could not be told. If they knew, they might panic. They might demand to be moved, and that would ruin the data. So, the order went out. Keep the signal secret. Let the beam continue. But as the months turned into years, and the 1950s bled into the 1960s, the medical files of the embassy staff began to show patterns that defied statistical probability. It started with blood counts. Then, it moved to something much darker. The background noise was no longer just noise. It was writing a message in the cells of the people working in that building. And to understand what that message said, we have to look at the secret project the CIA launched in response. A project named after a box that should never have been opened. The decision to keep the Moscow signal a secret marked the birth of one of the Cold War's most disturbing chapters, Project Pandora. In Washington, the discovery of the beam triggered a silent panic within the intelligence community. The Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense were faced with a paradox. The Soviets were bombarding the embassy, but they weren't disrupting communications. They weren't jamming radios. They were just beaming. The leading theory in 1954 was not biological warfare. It was espionage. American scientists believed the microwave beam was part of a sophisticated listening system. They theorized that the Soviets had hidden a passive device inside the Great Seal of the United States, the large wooden carving hanging in the ambassador's office. The theory was that the microwave beam would strike the carving, and the vibrations of the ambassador's voice would modulate the reflected wave, allowing the Soviets to listen in without a battery or a wire. They tore the office apart. They x-rayed the walls. They drilled into the Great Seal. They found nothing. It would be years before they actually found the thing, the passive listening device. But that was a separate technology. The beam remained, and because they couldn't find a listening device, the scientists at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, began to consider the darker alternative, the biological hypothesis. If the beam wasn't for listening, it was for affecting. This is where the archive chill truly sets in. We often think of the 1950s as a time of crude science, but in the shadows, researchers were already obsessed with the brain. The CIA was running MK Ultra, trying to control minds with LSD and hypnosis. Across the ocean, Soviet scientists were publishing papers on bioelectronics. The analysts at Project Pandora asked a simple, terrifying question: could a microwave signal, invisible and silent, interfere with the electrical firing of the human brain? The human brain operates on electricity. Neurons fire at specific frequencies. If the Soviets had found a way to broadcast a signal that matched the frequency of the human mind, could they induce confusion? Could they trigger fatigue? Could they make the American ambassador depressed, angry, or docile? To find out, Project Pandora didn't just study the embassy staff, they tried to replicate the weapon. In a classified laboratory in Maryland, the United States military began zapping test subjects and monkeys, initially with the exact frequency found in Moscow, 2.5 to 4.0 gigahertz. The results were inconsistent, but deeply unsettling. Some monkeys became lethargic, others became agitated. The scientists noted that the signals seemed to bypass the conscious senses and act directly on the nervous system. Back in Moscow, the human subjects were unaware they were part of the same experiment. The staff began to report strange phenomena. It wasn't just headaches, it was a specific type of fog. Diplomats who were known for their sharp memories began to forget names. Tempers flared in the cafeteria over trivial issues. A strange, metallic taste appeared in the mouths of the secretaries working near the windows. The State Department medical officers recorded these complaints. They wrote them down in the files. And then, under orders from Washington, they told the staff, "It's just the Moscow winter. It's cabin fever. You need to get more sleep." They lied. They knew the beam was hitting them. They knew the intensity was fluctuating, but they needed to know the long-term effects. By the early 1960s, the signal changed. The technicians monitoring the beam noticed the Soviets were altering the modulation. It wasn't just a steady wave anymore. It was pulsing. It was mimicking the natural rhythms of the human brain during deep sleep and high stress. This wasn't accidental interference. This was tuning. The Soviets were dialing it in. And then, the blood work came back. Routine physicals of the embassy staff showed a statistically impossible spike in white blood cell counts. Lymphocytes, the cells that fight infection and cancer, were behaving erratically. In a normal population, you might see this in 1 out of 1,000 people. In the Moscow embassy, it was happening to dozens. The background noise was beginning to rewrite the genetic code of the people inside the building. That the tragedy of the Moscow signal is not just in the radiation, it is in the hierarchy. The higher you rose in the embassy, the more radiation you absorbed. The chancellor's office, the ambassador's residence, the secure planning rooms, these were the targets. The beam was focused on the leadership. Ambassador Vautist, a dedicated public servant, began to suffer from a mysterious illness. His eyes bled. He suffered from severe nausea. Eventually, he would develop a rare blood disorder and die of leukemia. He was not the only one. Other staff members developed cancers that had no family history. 2 consecutive ambassadors died of cancer. When Stossel finally demanded to know if there was a threat, Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, faced a dilemma. To admit the signal existed was to admit that the US government had known about it for years and done nothing. It would cause a diplomatic crisis. It would cause a mutiny among the staff, so the cover-up deepened. The internal memos from this period, now declassified, are chilling in their cold calculus. They discuss the hazard pay differential. They discuss the cost of installing aluminum window screens versus the cost of treating potential leukemia. They weigh the psychological impact of telling the truth against the operational security of lying. In 1976, the truth finally broke. It didn't come from the government. It came from a leak. The Boston Globe published a story revealing the existence of the Moscow signal. The embassy erupted. Staff members who had brought their pregnant wives and young children to Moscow realized they had been living inside a microwave beam for their entire tour. panic set in. People demanded blood tests. They demanded to see their medical files. The State Department rushed to install aluminum screening on the Windows' ugly dark mesh that blocked the view but stopped the microwaves. They finally admitted the signal existed but downplayed the danger. It's harmless, they said. The levels are too low. But the veterans of Project Pandora knew better. They had seen the monkey trials. They had seen the blood counts. And then the signal stopped. Or rather, it vanished from the frequencies they were monitoring. Did the Soviets turn it off because they were caught, or did they turn it off because the experiment was finished? Modern analysis of the Moscow signal suggests a terrifying conclusion. The Soviets weren't trying to kill the diplomats. Dead diplomats are easily replaced. They were trying to impair them. They were trying to create a low-level cognitive fog that would give the Soviet negotiators a slight edge in every meeting, every treaty, every crisis. It was the ultimate passive weapon, a weapon of attrition. But the story doesn't end in 1976, and this is why this file remains relevant tonight. For decades, the Moscow signal was treated as a relic of the Cold War, a strange historical footnote, but in 2016, in Havana, Cuba, American diplomats began to hear a sound, a high-pitched, piercing noise. They felt pressure in their heads. They felt the fog. They suffered brain damage, nausea, and hearing loss. The symptoms were identical. The Havana Syndrome was not new. It was the return of the Moscow signal, refined, modernized, and weaponized with 21st century technology. The background noise anomaly of 1953 never really went away. The data collected by Project Pandora, data harvested from the bodies of the embassy staff, is likely the foundation of the directed energy weapons being used today. We are not looking at a closed case. We are looking at the prototype. And if the 1953 signal was the test run, and the Havana Syndrome is the deployment, the question remains, what did they learn in those 23 years of silence? To answer that, we must look at the specific physical evidence that the government tried to destroy. We need to look at the balcony across the street. We need to look at the machine itself. To find a ghost, you do not look for the ghost itself. You look for the shadow it casts. You look for the displacement of air, the sudden drop in temperature, or the static on a radio that should be silent. In the world of high-stakes espionage, ghosts are not spirits. They are wavelengths. They are invisible lines of force drawn across the sky, connecting a predator to its prey. In 1953, the men standing on the 10th floor of the US Embassy in Moscow were hunting a ghost. They knew it was there. They could feel the pressure in the room, a phantom sensation that had no physical cause. They had measured the anomaly, a steady, rhythmic pulsing of microwave radiation that washed over the ambassador's desk like an invisible tide. But measuring the water does not tell you where the ocean is. To stop the signal, or at least to understand why it was killing them, they had to find the source. They had to trace the invisible line back to its origin. What they found would become one of the most chilling images of the Cold War. It was not a military base, it was not a tank, it was a domestic facade, a wooden shutter on a residential balcony, hiding a machine that was slowly rewriting the biology of the people across the street. This file was stamped top secret because it revealed a terrifying truth that in the modern age, a weapon does not need to look like a weapon. It can look like a home. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the wind howling through the concrete canyons of Moscow. It is a hollow, lonely sound, rattling the double-paned glass of the embassy windows. Inside, the air is still and smells of warmed vacuum tubes, stale tobacco, and the ozone scent of high-voltage equipment. The file in front of us is thick, the paper yellowed with age, filled with hand-drawn diagrams of street maps and triangulation. Vectors, the ink has faded, but the coordinates remain sharp. Let us transport ourselves back to that room. It is night. The city outside is a monochrome landscape of gray snow and black iron. The technicians are tired. They have been working in shifts, sweeping the room with heavy, handheld antennas that look like the skeletons of umbrellas. They are wearing headphones, listening to the static of the ether. They are waiting for the scream. The process of triangulation is an exercise in geometry and patience. In 1953, there were no digital scanners that could instantly pinpoint a signal source on a 3D map. There were no automated drones to fly outside and look. There was only the human ear and the analog needle. The technicians moved the horn antenna, a funnel-shaped metal device designed to capture microwave frequencies, slowly across the horizon. They stood at the window of the Chancellor's office, shivering in the draft. They pointed the horn to the north, towards the Kremlin walls. The static in their headphones remained a low, steady hiss. The needle on the field strength meter hovered near zero. They rotated the device 10 degrees to the west. The hiss continued. They rotated another 10 degrees. The hiss changed pitch. It became a rhythmic thrum, a washing sound, like a helicopter rotor spinning in deep water. The needle jumped. They had found the edge of the beam. In the world of radio frequency engineering, a signal is rarely a perfect circle. It is a lobe. It spreads out from the source like the light from a flashlight. The further you are from the source, the wider the beam becomes. But this signal was different. As they swept the antenna back and forth, trying to find the center, they realized the beam was remarkably tight. It wasn't a floodlight. It was a laser. It was narrow, focused, and incredibly directional. This detail alone sent a chill through the team. A narrow beam implies intent. A wide broadcast could be an accident, a leaky radar tower at a nearby airport, a faulty radio transmitter. But a narrow beam, focused specifically on the 10th floor of a specific building, implies a sniper's precision. They marked the azimuth on their map. They moved down the hall to the next window and repeated the process. They found the signal again. They marked the second AZIMUTH. Then they took a ruler and drew 2 lines on the map of Moscow. The lines crossed at a single point on the other side of Markovaya Street. The technicians put down their equipment and picked up their binoculars. They looked through the glass, following the invisible line they had just drawn. It led them away from the embassy, across the 4 lanes of traffic, across the slush and the tram lines, to a massive, imposing residential building. It was a classic example of Stalinist architecture, heavy, brutal, and imposing. It was a bash grey cliff face of stone and concrete, rising 10 stories into the winter night. It was an apartment block for the Soviet elite party officials, scientists, celebrated artists. It was a place where people lived, slept, and raised children. Hundreds of windows looked back at the embassy. Most were dark. Some glowed with the warm yellow light of tungsten lamps, but the lines on the map pointed to a specific location on the upper floors. The technicians focused their binoculars. They scanned the facade. They counted the floors. 7, 8, 9. There. On the 9th floor, directly opposite the Chancellor's office, was a balcony. Unlike the others, which were open to the air or used to store bicycles and winter tires, this balcony was enclosed. It was shielded by heavy, wooden louver slats of timber angled downwards. To the casual observer walking on the street below, it looked like a privacy screen, a simple architectural detail, but to the men on the 10th floor of the embassy, looking at it through the lens of a field strength meter, it was a blazing sun. The meter pinned itself to the maximum reading. The audio in the headphones screamed. Behind those wooden slats, something was running, something massive, something that required enough power to light up a city block, yet remained completely silent. They had found the source, but finding it was only the beginning of the mystery, because the source wasn't a military bunker. It was apartment number 14. The discovery of the balcony created a profound psychological shift inside the embassy. Before the triangulation, the Moscow signal was an abstract concept. It was radiation, it was the environment. It was everywhere and nowhere now. It had an address. It had a face. Every morning the American diplomats would arrive at work, pour their coffee, and look out the window. And there it was. The wooden slats. The silent eye. They knew that behind that would, a technician, perhaps a young Soviet engineer, perhaps a KGB officer, was turning a dial, adjusting the frequency, and aiming the invisible gun directly at their heads. The proximity was maddening. It was less than 100 yards away. If they had opened the window and shouted, the person on the balcony might have heard them. But the diplomatic protocol, and the do not warn order from Washington, meant they had to pretend they saw nothing. They had to sit at their desks, feeling the phantom pressure in their temples, knowing they were being irradiated, while looking directly at the machine doing it. This is a specific type of torture known as the open secret. The victim knows, the perpetrator knows, the victim knows. But silence is maintained. The CIA brought in specialized photographers. They set up long-range cameras with telephoto lenses, hidden behind curtains in the embassy. They spent days photographing the balcony, waiting for us. They wanted to see the equipment. Was it a parabolic dish? Was it a helical antenna? Was it a massive vacuum tube array? They waited for the wind to blow the slats open. They waited for a maintenance worker to come out. But the Soviets were perfect in their discipline. The slats never moved. The balcony door never opened. The apartment appeared completely uninhabited. And yet, the physics told a different story. Let us pause to consider the physics of what was happening behind those wooden slats. To generate a microwave signal of that intensity 5 microwatts per square centimeter at a distance of 100 yards requires a significant amount of hardware. In 1953, you couldn't generate microwaves with a microchip. You needed a tube, specifically, a device called a magnetron or a These are heavy copper-wound vacuum tubes that use high-voltage electricity and powerful magnets to spin electrons into a frenzy, creating electromagnetic waves. These tubes are not efficient. They generate massive amounts of heat. If you run a high-power magnetron for more than a few minutes, it gets red hot. To keep it running 24 hours a day, as the Moscow signal did, you need a cooling system. You need water pumps, radiators, and fans. This meant that the apartment behind the balcony was not an apartment at all. It was likely gutted, the living room furniture replaced by racks of transformers, the kitchen plumbing repurposed to circulate coolant for the weapon, the floorboards reinforced to hold the weight of the generators. The technicians calculated the power draw. It would have been enormous. The cables running into that apartment would have been thick, industrial lines, likely routed through the walls to hide them from the neighbors. And this leads to the second layer of the mystery. The neighbors. The apartment building was full of people. Families lived above the source. Families lived below it. The walls of Soviet apartment blocks were notoriously thin. A generator of that size would vibrate. The hum of the transformers would be audible through the floor. The heat would radiate into the adjoining units. Yet, there were no complaints, no police reports, no angry neighbors banging on the door. This silence confirmed what the CIA analysts feared. The entire building was compromised. It wasn't just one apartment. The whole structure was part of the apparatus. The families living next door were likely vetted, selected for their loyalty, or perhaps they were not families at all, but other actors in the grand theater of the Cold War. The technicians on the 10th floor began to feel like they were living in a fishbowl. They were the subjects of an experiment, and the scientists were watching them from the residential building across the street. The geometry of the attack was also revealing. The technicians noticed that the beam wasn't just pointed at the building. It was pointed at a specific elevation. It was aimed to hit the Fresnel zone, the optimal path of transmission directly into the center of the ambassador's office window. When the ambassador stood up from his desk, he moved out of the peak intensity. When he sat down to read a classified cable, he lowered his head directly into the stream. This wasn't accidental interference. This was targeted. The Soviets had likely used a theodolite surveyor's tool to calculate the exact angle of elevation from the balcony to the desk chair. They had mapped the interior of the American embassy from the outside, and they were firing through the window with mathematical precision. But why? If the goal was to hurt the Americans, why use such a low power level? 5 microwatts is strange. It is too low to cause immediate thermal damage. You wouldn't feel your skin burning. You wouldn't go blind instantly. This low power level is what confused the scientists for years. In the 1950s, the Western understanding of biology was based on thermal effects. If radiation didn't heat you up, it was considered safe. But the Soviets had a different branch of science. They called it psychotronics. They believed that the human brain, which operates on weak electrical signals, could be influenced by external electromagnetic fields. They believed that if you could match the frequency of the beam to the frequency of the brain's alpha or theta waves, you could disrupt the mind without burning the body. The balcony wasn't an oven, it was a jammer, and the target wasn't the radio equipment. The target was the neural pathways of the ambassador. Imagine the psychological state of the embassy staff. You are working 12 hours a day. You are under immense pressure to prevent a nuclear war. And every time you look up, you see the wooden slats across the street. You know it is hitting you. You feel the fog in your brain. You feel the sudden, unexplained exhaustion, and yet you cannot speak of it, because to speak of it would be to acknowledge a weakness, and the official stance of the US State Department was that the beam did not exist. When American diplomats eventually confronted their Soviet counterparts, casually mentioning the interference on their radios, the Soviets smiled. They played their role perfectly. Interference, they would say. Perhaps it is the tram lines. Or maybe your equipment is malfunctioning. We detect no signals. They denied the existence of the balcony's purpose while standing in a room that was being bathed in its output. This was the gaslight. They forced the Americans to question their own reality. Are we imagining it? Is the equipment wrong? Am I sick, or is it the beam? The balcony became a silent monster. It stood there, day and night, summer and winter. In the rain, the wooden slats would darken with moisture, but the heat from the machine inside would dry them out faster than the other balconies. In the winter, the snow would melt off the balcony ledge while the others remained frozen. These were the subtle clues. The thermal footprint of the invisible weapon. The technicians documented all of it. They tracked the melt patterns of the snow. They tracked the fluctuations in the signal intensity. They noticed that the signal often increased in power during times of political crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the balcony screamed. During quiet periods, it hummed. It was a barometer of the Cold War, measuring the tension between the two superpowers and gig. The discovery of the source naturally led to the question of defense. If we know where it is, can we block it? The technicians proposed building a shield. They wanted to turn the embassy into a Faraday cage, a metal enclosure that blocks electromagnetic fields. But you cannot encase a diplomatic building in solid steel. You need windows. You need light. You need to look like a friendly, open nation, not a bunker. So, they compromised. They installed aluminum screens on the windows. To the casual eye, they looked like insect screens, mosquito nets, but they were made of heavy-gauge aluminum wire, woven specifically to a mesh size that would scatter the 2.5 GHz wavelength. The installation was done quietly. Workmen appeared on the ledge, fitting the dark screens over the glass. Inside, the light grew dimmer. The view of Moscow became obscured by the fine metal grid. The world outside looked like a prisoner's view, chopped into tiny squares. Did it work? The technicians walked into the chancellor's office with their meters. They stood behind the new screen. The needle dropped. The intensity was reduced by 90%. For a moment there was relief. The staff felt safer. The fishbowl had walls now, but the relief was short-lived. Within weeks, the technicians noticed a change on the balcony across the street. The signal strength increased. The Soviets had simply turned up the power. They cranked the voltage on the magnetons. They punched through the screens. It was a slow-motion arms race, fought in the space of 100 yards. We put up a shield. They built a bigger gun. We added more shielding. They changed the frequency. The technicians realized that as long as the balcony existed, they were vulnerable. The only way to stop the signal was to destroy the source. But you cannot bomb an apartment building in the capital of a nuclear superpower. You cannot send a team of commandos to raid apartment 14. So, the beam stayed on. And the technicians began to notice something else. The beam wasn't just coming from the balcony anymore. As the years went on, the triangulation lines began to get messy. The signal was bouncing. Microwaves reflect off metal and concrete. The beam from the balcony was hitting the flat face of the embassy, but it was also hitting the street below, the cars, the metal roof of the guard shack. The signal was scattering, creating hotspots in unexpected places. A secretary working in a room on the side of the building, theoretically out of the line of fire, might be sitting in a reflected hotspot, absorbing twice the radiation of the ambassador. The building became a hall of mirrors. You couldn't hide. You couldn't dodge. The physics of the wave meant that it filled the space, bouncing and refracting until the entire structure was humming. The balcony was the source, but the embassy itself had become the weapon. The building was amplifying the attack. It is important to remember the human element of this triangulation. The men who held the meters, the men who drew the lines on the maps, they were the first victims. They spent the most time standing in the window, unprotected, trying to get an accurate reading. They stood in the direct path of the beam for hours, holding the antennas, listening to the sound. They were the canaries in the coal mine. Years later, when the health studies were finally conducted, the technicians showed the highest rates of chromosomal damage. Their blood cells had broken down. Their DNA had unraveled. They had triangulated the source, but in doing so, they had absorbed the message. The balcony across the street remained a fixture of the Moscow skyline for over 20 years. It outlasted presidents. It outlasted premiers. It became part of the scenery, as permanent and ignored as a chimney or a lamppost. But inside the files of the NSA and the CIA, the coordinates of that balcony were burned into the memory of the intelligence community. It was proof that the enemy was willing to do something we were not. They were willing to turn the environment itself into a hostile agent. They didn't need to plant a bomb. They just needed to change the air. And while the technicians focused on the where, the balcony, the apartment, the street, the bureaucrats in Washington were making a decision about the who. Because once you know where the bullet is coming from, and you decide not to fire back, and you decide not to move the target, you become complicit in the shooting. That the triangulation was complete. The source was identified. The physics were understood. The danger was quantified. By all logic, this should have been the end of the story. The US government should have evacuated the building. They should have pulled the staff out of the line of fire. They should have declared the embassy unsafe for human habitation. but they didn't. The file we are reading tonight takes a dark turn here. It moves from the technical diagrams of the engineers to the typed memos of the policymakers. When the report on the balcony reached the desk of the Secretary of State, it was not met with outrage, it was met with curiosity. If the Soviets are doing this, the logic went, then we have a unique opportunity. They realized that they had a controlled population, thousands of Americans living in a specific building, eating specific food, breathing specific air and being irradiated by a specific frequency. If they moved the staff, the experiment would end. We would never know what long-term exposure to low-level microwaves does to the human body. We would never know if the mind control theories were true. So, a new order was drafted. It was not sent to the embassy in Moscow. It was locked in a safe in Washington. The order was simple. Do not tell them. Let the technicians measure the beam. Let the security guards watch the balcony. But do not tell the secretaries, the clerks, or the wives why they are getting headaches. Do not tell them why the snow melts on the balcony across the street. We have found the source. But now we must let it run. The tragedy of the Moscow signal is not that we couldn't find the gun. It is that once we found it, we decided to watch the bullets hit. The file was stamped notice, no distribution, and the silence inside the embassy was about to become much louder than the noise from across the street. The balcony is still there in the old photographs, a dark wooden eye, watching, but the real secret wasn't behind the wooden slats. It was in the silence of the people who knew, and said nothing. Asterisk, there is a specific type of violence that leaves no bruises. It does not involve a weapon you can hold in your hand, and it does not happen on a battlefield. It happens in a quiet room, with a pen, a piece of paper, and a signature. It is the violence of omission, the violence of knowing a truth that could save a life, and choosing, with cold, mathematical precision, to keep that truth locked away in a safe dot in the history of the Cold War. There are many stories of spies betraying their countries, but the file we are opening tonight is not about a spy selling secrets to the enemy. It is about a government keeping secrets from its own people. When the technicians confirmed that the US Embassy in Moscow was being bombarded by microwave radiation, the logical next step, the human step, would have been to sound the alarm, to evacuate, to protest. But logic in the intelligence community is not human, it is operational. The men in Washington looked at the data, they looked at the beam coming from the balcony, and they saw something that terrified them, not because it was a threat, but because it was an opportunity. They realized that the Soviet Union had inadvertently created the perfect laboratory, and the Americans working inside the embassy, the clerks, the translators, the young families were no longer just diplomats, they were specimens. To warn them would be to ruin the experiment. So, the order was given, the protocol was set, the file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight, ... The only sound is the rhythmic thrum of the air conditioning system, recycling the same stale air through the windowless corridors of the State Department. The file on the desk is heavy, bound in a pale yellow cover that has become brittle with time. The pages inside are thin, onion skin paper, covered in the sharp, mechanical typeface of a 1950s typewriter. The smell is of dust, old glue, and the faint metallic scent of a vault that has not been opened in decades. Let us step into the mindset of the men who wrote these memos. It is a cold, gray mental space, a place where morality is traded for data. To understand the betrayal, we must understand the timing. It is the height of the 1950s. The world is divided into two distinct colors on a map, the blue of the West and the red of the East. Paranoia is not a mental illness, it is a survival strategy. When the report regarding the Moscow signal arrived in Washington, it bypassed the usual channels. It did not go to the Human Resources Department. It did not go to the Medical Safety Board. It went directly to the Intelligence Directorate, the CIA, the NSA, and the upper echelons of the State Department. A meeting was convened. We do not have the minutes of every word spoken, but we have the outcome. The analysts presented the facts. The Soviets are bathing our embassy in low-level microwaves. We do not know why. We do not know what it does to the human body. There were two options on the table. Option A, issue a formal diplomatic protest, demand the signal be turned off, install heavy shielding, inform the staff that they are under electronic attack and offer them the chance to transfer home. Option B, do nothing. Option A had a fatal flaw in the eyes of the intelligence chiefs. If the US complained, the Soviets would know that the Americans had detected the signal. They would know their frequency had been found. They would simply turn it off, or worse, change the frequency to something the Americans couldn't detect. The window into the Soviet capability would close. Furthermore, if the staff were warned, they would panic. Psychosomatic symptoms would spread. Every headache, every cold, every moment of forgetfulness would be blamed on the beam. The data would be corrupted by fear. Option B, however, offered a grim possibility. If they did nothing, the signal would continue. The Soviets would keep firing, and the Americans could quietly, secretly, monitor the health of their own staff. They could use their own ambassadors as a control group in a massive, unauthorized biological study. They chose option B. The decision was codified in a protocol known as notice, no distribution. It meant that the information was restricted to a tiny circle of people. The ambassador himself was often kept in the dark, or given only partial truths, until he became too sick to ignore that the do not warn protocol was not a passive act. It required active deception. It meant that when a secretary went to the embassy doctor complaining of strange fatigue, the doctor, who often didn't know the truth, either would prescribe vitamins or rest. The medical reports were filed, but the root cause was never investigated, because the existence of the root cause was classified. This created a surreal duality within the embassy. On the surface, it was business as usual. Cocktail parties were held, visas were stamped, telegrams were typed. But underneath the surface, everyone was walking through an invisible minefield. The walls of the embassy, which were supposed to offer protection, had become the walls of a cage. And the keepers of the cage were not the Soviets outside, but the superiors back in Washington. Let us analyze the scientific curiosity that drove this decision. Why were they so desperate to keep the beam a secret? In the 1950s and 60s, the United States was terrified of mind control. The CIA was running its own dark programs, like MK-Ultra, trying to see if LSD or hypnosis could break a human mind. They were obsessed with the idea that the Soviets were ahead in the race to control human behavior. When the Moscow signal was discovered, the CIA analysts didn't just see a health hazard, they saw a potential psychotronic weapon. They hypothesized that the Soviets had discovered a frequency that could trigger depression, docility, or confusion. If this was true, it was the ultimate weapon. You could conquer a nation without firing a shot, simply by beaming a signal that made the population too tired to resist. Washington needed to know if it worked, and the only way to know if it worked was to let the subjects, the embassy staff, absorb the radiation and see what happened. They became canaries in the coal mine, but unlike the canary, which is carried into the mine by a miner who shares the risk, the staff were sent in alone, while the observers watched from the safety of Langley and Foggy Bottom. The protocol required a cover story. If the staff asked about the strange equipment the security technicians were using, they were told it was routine debugging. If they asked about the new aluminum screens being installed on the windows, they were told it was for security or insulation. The lie was maintained with absolute discipline. Over the course of 2 decades, thousands of Americans rotated through the Moscow embassy. They brought their spouses. They brought their children. Pregnant women worked in offices directly in the path of the beam. And all the while, the file in Washington grew thicker. The most chilling aspect of the Do Not Warn protocol is how it distorted the relationship between the government and its servants. A diplomat is sworn to serve the state. In return, the state is expected to protect the diplomat. In Moscow, this contract was inverted. The diplomat existed to feed the state data, at the cost of their own biology. Consider the daily routine of a cipher clerk in 1965. He arrives at the embassy at 8 a.m. He works in a secure, windowless room or vault within the building. But to get there, he walks through corridors that are washed in the 2.5 GHz signal. He eats lunch in the cafeteria, which faces the street. He spends 8 to 10 hours a day inside the field. He begins to feel a strange pressure in his head. Not a headache, exactly, but a fullness. He finds himself forgetting simple codes he has used for years. He becomes irritable with his wife. He develops a skin rash that won't go away. He goes to the embassy nurse. She takes his blood pressure. It is high. She takes a blood sample. This blood sample is where the betrayal becomes physical. The sample is sent to a laboratory. The clerk is told everything is normal. Just stress, they say. The Moscow winter is hard on everyone. But the sample is not just checked for cholesterol. It is flagged. It is sent to a specific desk at the CIA's Office of Medical Services. There, it is compared to the samples of other staff members. They are looking for lymphocytosis, an abnormal increase in white blood cells. They are looking for chromosomal breakage. They find it. The data confirms that the blood of the embassy staff is changing. The DNA is unraveling under the constant bombardment of microwaves. Does this trigger an evacuation? No. It triggers a new study. The scientists in Washington give the phenomenon a code name, They treat the rising white blood cell counts as data points on a graph. They track the viral spread of these symptoms, fully aware that the virus is a beam of energy coming from the apartment across the street. The staff members are never shown their own true medical charts. The real files are kept separate, compartmented away from the standard personnel records. A shadow medical history is created for each person, one that is clean, normal, and safe. The real history, the one full of red flags and radiation markers, is locked in the vault. That's went on for years. As we move into the 1970s, the cover-up becomes more difficult to maintain. The signal gets stronger, the health problems get worse, and the man at the center of the web is Henry Kissinger. Documents released decades later show the intense internal debate. By the mid-70s, the link between the signal and the health issues was becoming undeniable. Ambassador Bautista Sol, a man who was blindly loyal to his duty, began to suffer from bleeding eyes and severe blood disorders. He was literally dying at his post. He eventually confronted Kissinger. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to warn his staff. The response from Washington was a masterclass in bureaucratic stalling. They argued that linking the signal to the health problems was speculative. They argued that warning the staff would cause hysteria that would be more damaging than the radiation itself. They used the concept of the nocebo effect, the idea that if you tell someone they are sick, they will become sick. They argued they were protecting the staff by lying to them. It was a paternalistic cruelty. We know better than you. We will carry the burden of the truth, so you don't have to worry. But the staff was worrying. Rumors were circulating. You cannot hide a secret that big forever. People noticed the technicians. They noticed the burn sensation in certain rooms. The do not warn protocol began to fracture, not because the government developed a conscience, but because the secret was about to leak. In 1976, the Boston Globe finally broke the story. The headline screamed the truth that had been hidden for 23 years. The reaction inside the embassy was immediate and furious. The staff felt like lab rats. They realized that their own government had prioritized intelligence gathering over their lives. They realized that every time a doctor had told them it's just stress, it was a lie drafted in a committee meeting in Washington. But even then, the government tried to hold the line. They admitted the signal existed, but they denied it was harmful. They pointed to the lack of thermal damage. You weren't cooked, they said, so you weren't hurt. It was a defense based on obsolete science, used to justify a modern atrocity. The do not warn protocol left a scar that was not visible on the skin, but was etched into the psyche of the American intelligence community. It established a precedent that the biological integrity of an employee is secondary to the mission. This is a terrifying thought for anyone who has ever signed a government contract. We assume that if we are sent into danger, we will be told where the landmines are. We assume our protective gear works. We assume that if the Geiger counter starts clicking, someone will pull us out. In Moscow, the Geiger counters were clicking for 20 years, and the only order given was turn off the sound. The file reveals something else, something even darker. The US government wasn't just passively observing. They were comparing the Moscow data to their own experiments. While the embassy staff were being irradiated in Russia, the US military was running parallel tests in the United States. They were zapping volunteers and non-volunteers with microwaves to see if they could replicate the Moscow effect. The silence in the embassy was necessary to protect the domestic experiments. If the US government admitted that the Moscow signal was dangerous, they would have to admit that their own microwave weapons programs, which they were secretly developing, were also dangerous. They were trapped in a web of their own making. To condemn the Soviets was to condemn themselves. So, they stayed silent, and the diplomats paid the price. Imagine being a child growing up in that embassy compound. You play in the courtyard. You sleep in a bed near the window. You are completely innocent of geopolitics. You do not know what the Cold War is. But your cells know. Your bone marrow knows. Years later, when these children grew up, many of them developed rare cancers. Many struggled with immune system disorders. When they tried to sue the government, they hit a wall of sovereign immunity and classified national security information. The do not warn protocol didn't end when the staff left Moscow. It followed them home. It followed them into the hospitals. It followed them to their graves. The government could not admit liability, because to admit liability was to admit that the policy existed, so the denial continued. No evidence of harm, no causal link, inconclusive data. These are the phrases used to bury the truth. They are the shield walls of the bureaucracy, that we must look at this through the lens of the era. The 1950s and 60s were a time of the greater good. The individual was expendable in the fight against communism. The logic was utilitarian. If sacrificing the long-term health of a few hundred diplomats helped the US understand Soviet capabilities, it was considered a fair trade. But who decided it was fair? The people making the trade were not the ones in the embassy. They were in air-conditioned offices in DC, far away from the beam. This disconnect is the heart of the betrayal. It is the distance between the decision and the consequence. The do not warn protocol is a case study in how secrecy corrupts. It starts with a small lie. We don't want to panic them. It grows into a medium lie. We need more data. And it ends with a monstrous lie. Nothing happened. The file we are examining tonight is a testament to that corruption. It is a collection of memos that rationalize the irrational. It turns human beings into assets, and assets into liabilities. The silence was eventually broken, but the damage was done. The Do Not Warn Protocol remains one of the most cynical chapters in American history. It proved that the government was willing to let its own people walk into an invisible fire, just to see how long they could stand the heat. But there is a missing piece to this puzzle. We have talked about the signal, we have talked about the cover-up, but we haven't talked about why the US government was so obsessed with the data. They weren't just watching the embassy staff out of morbid curiosity. They were watching because they needed the answers for their own project. While the diplomats in Moscow were suffering, a secret team of scientists in a DARPA laboratory in Maryland was building a machine. They were building a replica of the Moscow balcony, and they weren't aiming it at diplomats. They were aiming it at primates. They needed to know if the mind control theory was real. They needed to know if they could use the same invisible beam to turn a living creature into a puppet. The betrayal in Moscow was just a passive phase. The active phase was about to begin. The code name for this phase was buried even deeper than the Do Not Warn memos. It was a project named after a mythological box that released all the evils of the world. The file is marked Project Pandora, and to understand the true horror of the Moscow signal, we must leave the embassy and enter the laboratory. The diplomats were the accidental test subjects. Now we turn our attention to the intentional ones. The file is stamped top secret, and inside, the cages are waiting. There are names given to government projects that are random generated by a computer to mean nothing. Operation Blue Book, Project Paperclip. But sometimes, the name is a warning. Sometimes, the name is chosen by a man who knows exactly what he is about to unleash. In 1965, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, initiated a top-secret study to understand the invisible beam hitting the US Embassy in Moscow. They did not call it the Moscow study. They did not call it microwave analysis. They named it Project Pandora. In mythology, Pandora was the woman who opened a forbidden jar and released sickness, death, and chaos into the world, leaving only hope trapped inside. The men who named this project knew the metaphor. They knew that by asking the question, can the human mind be controlled by a remote signal, they were opening a box that could never be closed. They were acknowledging that the atmosphere itself could be weaponized. The file we are accessing tonight is the lid of that box. It details a secret war fought not with soldiers, but with frequencies. It documents the moment when the United States government stopped looking at the Moscow signal as a diplomatic problem, and started looking at it as the future of warfare. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The air in the room changes. It is no longer the stale cigarette-filled air of the embassy office. It is the sterile, ozone-scented air of a laboratory. The only sound is the low, throbbing hum of a massive power transformer, a sound that vibrates in the chest rather than the ears. The light is harsh, fluorescent, reflecting off stainless steel cages and banks of oscilloscopes. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. To understand Project Pandora, we must leave the cold streets of Moscow and travel to the quiet, leafy suburbs of Maryland. Here, hidden behind the fences of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and in the classified corridors of DARPA, a new kind of science was being born. The mandate for Project Pandora was simple yet terrifying. Replicate the signal. The intelligence community was divided. The old guard, the physicists and engineers believed the Moscow signal was thermal. They argued that unless the beam cooked you, it couldn't hurt you. They looked at the power levels 5 microwatts and laughed. It's too weak, they said. It's like trying to boil a kettle with a flashlight. But the new guard, the biologists and the behavioral psychologists were terrified. They knew something the physicists ignored. They knew that the human body is not a kettle. It is an electrical machine. The heart beats on an electrical impulse. The brain thinks in electrical waves. The central hypothesis of Project Pandora was this: what if the Soviets aren't trying to heat the body? What if they are trying to tune it? Imagine a radio. If you want to jam a radio station, you don't need to melt the radio. You just need to broadcast a stronger signal on the same frequency. The scientists at DARPA asked, what is the frequency of the human brain? They knew that the brain operates in specific cycles. Alpha waves, beta waves, delta waves. These cycles control our sleep, our alertness, our anxiety. If the Moscow signal pulsing at specific rates could mimic these natural waves, could it entrain the brains of the diplomats? Could it force their minds to sync up with an external rhythm, induced by a machine across the street? This was the question that justified the budget. This was the question that allowed them to build the Pandora test rig. They constructed a room, a special shielded chamber designed to block out all external radio noise. Inside this room, they set up an emitter, a duplicate of the device on the Moscow balcony. They tuned it to exactly 2.5 to 4.0 GHz. They modulated the signal to match the pulses recorded by the surveillance teams in Russia, and then they needed subjects. The ethics of the 1960s were flexible, especially when national security was invoked. Project Pandora was classified at the highest level. This meant there was no oversight committee. There were no public hearings. There were only the men in the room and the orders they followed. The initial subjects were not humans. They were primates. Rhesus monkeys, chimpanzees, animals with nervous systems similar enough to ours to provide data, but different enough to be expendable. The scientists placed the monkeys in the chamber. They turned on the signal, and they watched. They were looking for subtle changes. They weren't looking for burns or seizures. They were looking for behavioral modification. The logs from these experiments are dry, clinical, and deeply disturbing. One entry notes that a monkey, normally aggressive, became passive and stared at the wall for hours while the signal was active. Another entry notes that a different subject became unable to perform simple tasks it had previously mastered. The signal was doing something. It was bypassing the senses. The monkey couldn't see the beam, couldn't hear it, couldn't feel it, but its brain was reacting. The signal-to-noise ratio in the animal's nervous system was being corrupted. This was the eureka moment for Project Pandora. It proved that the thermal theory was wrong. You didn't need heat to cause damage. You just needed information. The signal was the weapon, but proving it in a monkey was one thing. Understanding how it worked on a diplomat, trying to negotiate a nuclear treaty was another. The scientists needed to understand the mechanism. How did a microwave, which should bounce off the skin, penetrate deep into the brain? They discovered something called demodulation. The theory was that the skull itself acted as a receiver. The brain tissue, suspended in fluid, could act as a stripping the carrier wave and leaving only the low-frequency pulse to beat to rattle around inside the neural network. It was, in effect, a way to whisper directly into the subconscious. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets could do this, they didn't need spies. They could just beam a signal into the White House, or the Pentagon, or a command bunker, and slowly degrade the decision-making abilities of the American leadership. They could make a president depressed. They could make a general hesitant. Project Pandora ceased to be a medical study and became a frantic race to close the gap, the mind control gap. The secrecy surrounding Project Pandora created a strange distortion in reality. While the scientists in Maryland were confirming the danger, the State Department was still telling the staff in Moscow that they were safe. This is the central paradox of the archive chill. The knowledge existed. It was typed up, triple-checked, and filed in a safe. But it was not used to protect the people. It was used to analyze them. The head of Project Pandora was a man named Richard Cesaro. He was a brilliant, driven researcher at DARPA. He became obsessed with the signal. He believed that the Moscow signal was the most important discovery of the 20th century. He argued that it wasn't just a threat. It was a potential breakthrough. If the Soviets could use it to hurt, the Americans could use it to help, or to control. Cesaro's memos, written in the mid-60s, read like science fiction. He speculated about using microwaves to induce specific emotions. He wondered if you could beam courage into soldiers, or fear into rioters. The line between defense and offense blurred. But to get there, he needed more data. He pushed the experiments further. The testing protocols became more rigorous. They began to expose the test subjects to the signal for longer durations, weeks, then months. They wanted to simulate the Moscow environment perfectly. They found that the effects were cumulative. A monkey exposed for an hour showed no change. A monkey exposed for a week showed stress. A monkey exposed for a month showed signs of biological breakdown. The immune systems of the test subjects began to crash. This mirrored exactly what was happening in the embassy. The white blood cells were confused. The body was fighting a ghost. This confirmed a biological stress theory. The body perceives the microwave field as an intruder. It stays in a state of high alert, 24 hours a day. Eventually, the system exhausts itself. The adrenal glands burn out. The immune system gives up, and that is when cancer gets a foothold. The Pandora scientists realized that the Soviets weren't using a magic mind control ray. They were using a stress ray. They were simply exhausting the Americans to death, cell by cell. But not everyone accepted these results. Science, especially government science, is political. The CIA loved the Pandora results because it justified their paranoia. It gave them a reason to spy harder. The State Department hated the Pandora results. If Pandora was right, then the State Department was negligent. If Pandora was right, they had to close the embassy. They had to pay millions in compensation. They had to admit they had been outsmarted. So, a war began within the government. Not a war of weapons, but a war of memos. The State Department hired their own scientists to review the Pandora data. These scientists were given a specific, unspoken instruction: find flaws, debunk it, make the problem go away. They attacked the methodology. The monkeys are different from humans, they said. The sample size is too small. The frequency wasn't exact. They created a cloud of doubt. This is a classic technique in the management of classified secrets. You don't delete the truth. You dilute it. You surround the disturbing data with conflicting reports, until no one knows what to believe. Project Pandora became a battleground. On one side, the DARPA researchers, convinced they were looking at a weapon of mass destruction. On the other side, the bureaucrats, convinced they were looking at a diplomatic inconvenience. And in the middle, still sitting at their desks in Moscow, were the people. One of the key discoveries during the Pandora era was a phenomenon known as the Frey effect, or microwave hearing. An American scientist named Alan Frey discovered that humans could actually hear microwaves, that it wasn't sound entering the ear canal. It was the energy of the beam hitting the temporal lobe and causing a thermally elastic expansion, a tiny, microscopic click inside the head. If the beam was pulsed, the clicks sounded like a buzz, or a hiss, or even words. Frey published his findings. The military immediately knocked on his door. Project Pandora incorporated Frey's work. They realized that the Moscow signal was hitting the auditory cortex of the diplomats. Even if they didn't consciously hear a sound, their brains were processing the noise. Imagine trying to sleep while a neighbor plays a drum set next door. Now imagine the drum set is silent, but your brain still registers the beat. That is the torture of the Moscow signal. It was a subliminal drumbeat, pounding away at the sanity of the staff. Night after night, the scientists at Pandora tried to map this. They tried to find the resonant frequency of the human skull. They wanted to know if they could broadcast a voice directly into a person's head. This is where the file gets darkest. The line between investigating the Soviet threat and developing an American weapon disappears completely. Project Pandora wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about catching up. By 1970, Project Pandora was officially closed. The final report was inconclusive, intentionally so. It stated that the effects on the monkeys were ambiguous. It stated that while there were biological changes, they couldn't be definitively linked to the signal. It was a whitewash, a cover-up designed to protect the Do Not Warn protocol, but the real work didn't stop. It just moved. Project Pandora was the trunk of the tree. When it was cut down, the roots spread out into other, blacker projects. The research was split up. The Army took the biological data. The CIA took the behavioral data. The Air Force took the weaponization data. The scientists who worked on Pandora didn't retire. They went into the deep black world of non-lethal weapons. They took the lessons of the Moscow signal, the frequency, the modulation, the power density, and they built the next generation of devices. Today, we have active denial systems, microwave crowd control weapons that heat the skin. We have voice-to-skull technology. We have Havana Syndrome. All of these modern anomalies are the children of Pandora. The archive chill comes from realizing that the experiment never really ended. The embassy in Moscow was just phase 1. Pause for a moment. Listen to the hum of the room you are in. The Wi-Fi router, the cell phone tower down the street, the Bluetooth signals crisscrossing the air. We live in an ocean of frequencies. We assume they are harmless because we are told they are harmless. But the men of Project Pandora proved, 50 years ago, that harmless is a relative term. They proved that an invisible signal, carrying no heat, could change the way a living thing thinks. They proved that the barrier between the mind and the air is thinner than we believe. The legacy of Project Pandora is not in the report they published. It is in the silence that followed. It is in the fact that for 50 years, no one talked about the monkeys. No one talked about the blood counts. The box was opened. The demons flew out. And then the government simply closed the lid and pretended nothing had escaped. But there was one specific part of Project Pandora that was too disturbing even for the generals. It wasn't the monkeys. It wasn't the blood. It was the chimpanzee trials. You see, a rhesus monkey is distant from a human, but a chimpanzee is a cousin. A chimpanzee has complex emotions. It has a social structure. It has a memory. When they put the chimpanzees in the signal path, the results were not just biological, they were psychological. The chimpanzees didn't just get sick, they changed. They stopped acting like chimpanzees. The specific details of the chimpanzee experiments are the most heavily redacted pages in the Pandora file. Why, what did they see in those cages that made them black out the lines with heavy ink? What happens when a higher primate is subjected to the Moscow signal? The scientists noted that the chimpanzees lost their sense of time. They lost their ability to perform sequential tasks. It was as if the signal was scrambling the linear processing of the brain. This leads us to the most terrifying implication for the humans in the embassy. If the signal scrambles time perception, if it scrambles sequence, then the diplomats weren't just tired, they were living in a fractured reality. Project Pandora proved the concept, but to see the true horror we have to look at the specific day-by-day logs of the replication trials. We have to look at the moment when the scientists realized they weren't just observing a weapon, they were observing a method of erasing the self. The file on the chimpanzees is thin, but the content is heavy. The signal was tuned, the cage was locked, and the subject was waiting. There is a line in the ethical code of science that separates the human from the animal. It is a line drawn in sand, often shifting, often blurred by the necessities of war. In the early days of Project Pandora, the scientists stayed on the safe side of that line. They tested the Moscow signal on rats. They tested it on rabbits. These were simple organisms, reacting to simple stimuli. If a rat stopped eating, it was a data point. If a rabbit became lethargic, it was a statistic. But the men running Project Pandora knew that the data from a rat was useless when trying to understand the mind of an ambassador. A rat does not negotiate treaties. A rat does not feel existential dread. To understand what the invisible beam was doing to the diplomats in Moscow, they needed a subject that could think, feel, and remember. They needed a subject that shared 98% of the human genetic code. In 1966, the order came down to escalate the testing. The cages were enlarged, the security clearance was raised, and the chimpanzees were brought in. The file detailing these experiments is one of the darkest corners of the Pandora archive. It documents the moment when the US government decided to break the mind of a primate, simply to see if the Soviets were breaking the minds of their people. It is a story of isolation, of silent frequencies, and of the slow, deliberate erasure of consciousness. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The environment is sterile. We are deep inside the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, in a sub-basement designed to contain biological hazards. But there are no viruses here. There are no bacteria. The hazard is invisible. The walls are lined with echo-absorbent foam strange geometric spikes of black carbon designed to stop microwaves from bouncing. It creates a dead room, a place where sound and energy go to die. In the center of the room sits a chair. It is made of non-conductive plastic, so it won't interfere with the signal. Above the chair, aimed downward at a 45-degree angle, is a horn antenna. It looks like a loudspeaker, but it emits no sound. It is connected to a rack of amplifiers and signal generators, humming with the power of a small city block. The shift from rhesus monkeys to chimpanzees was significant. A rhesus monkey is wild, reactive, and instinctual. A chimpanzee is thoughtful. It has a personality. It has a concept of self. The scientists of Project Pandora needed this complexity. They weren't just looking for physical damage. They were looking for cognitive damage. They wanted to know if the Moscow signal could take a complex task and make it impossible. They selected their subjects carefully. These were chimpanzees that had been trained for months. They knew how to solve puzzles. They knew how to press buttons in a specific sequence to get a reward. They understood time, wait for the light, then press the button. They understood cause and effect. The goal of the experiment was terrifyingly simple: irradiate the subject with the weak 2.5 GHz signal found in Moscow, and see if the chimpanzee forgets who it is. The protocol was rigorous. The chimpanzee would be placed in the chair. The room would be sealed. For hours, there would be silence. Just the animal and the antenna. Then, the technicians in the control room would flip the switch. To the naked eye, nothing happened. The air didn't shimmer. The temperature didn't rise. The chimpanzee didn't flinch. The signal was orthermal, too weak to feel, but strong enough to resonate. The scientists watched through a lead glass window. They held stopwatches. They held clipboards. They were waiting for the fog to set in. In the early trials, the results were subtle. The chimpanzee would continue to solve the puzzles. It would press the buttons. It would eat the fruit. But as the days turned into weeks, the Pandora effect began to manifest. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow erosion. The first sign was hesitation. A chimpanzee that had performed a task perfectly 1,000 times would suddenly stop. It would look at the button. It would look at its hand. It would look at the wall. It wasn't that it couldn't move. It was that the connection between thought and action had been interrupted. The scientists called this latency. We call it confusion. The signal was interfering with the synaptic firing in the brain. It was introducing noise into the neural network. Imagine trying to listen to a symphony while someone is whispering random numbers in your ear. You can still hear the music, but you can't follow the melody. The chimpanzees were losing the melody of their own thoughts. The replication aspect of the experiment was crucial. The scientists didn't just blast the animals with random noise. They modulated the signal to match the specific pulse rate of the Moscow balcony. They found that when they pulsed the signal at specific frequencies around 5 to 7 Hz, effects were amplified. Why 5 to 7 Hz? Because that is the frequency of the mammalian brain in a state of deep relaxation or light sleep. It is the theta state. By broadcasting a theta wave at an awake chimpanzee, the signal was forcing the brain into a paradoxical state. The eyes were open, the body was awake, but the brain was being told to sleep. This created a state of waking dream. The chimpanzees became docile. Their aggression vanished. They would sit for hours staring at dust motes in the air, completely unbothered by the isolation. To a casual observer, they looked calm. To the neurologists, they looked lobotomized. The implications for the diplomats in Moscow were immediate and chilling. If the Soviets were beaming a sleep signal into the embassy during the working day, it explained the lethargy. It explained why brilliant negotiators were making sloppy mistakes. It explained why secretaries were staring at their typewriters, unable to remember the next word. The chimpanzees were proving that you didn't need to drug a person to sedate them, you just needed to tune them to the right frequency. But the experiment didn't stop at sedation. The scientists wanted to see if they could induce stress. They changed the modulation. They cranked the pulse rate up to 15 Hz, the beta state of high anxiety. The reaction in the cage was immediate. The chimpanzees stopped staring. They started pacing. They picked at their skin. They checked the locks on the door repeatedly. They showed signs of intense, non-specific paranoia. There was no threat in the room, no snake, no rival male, but the signal was telling their amygdala that danger was present. The scientists noted in the logs, subject exhibits chemically induced anxiety. Without chemical agents, they had found the volume knob for fear. One of the most disturbing anomalies found in the chimpanzee trials was the distortion of time perception. Time is not an absolute. It is a construct of the brain. We know 5 minutes have passed because our internal clock, the circadian rhythm and the firing rate of our neurons tells us so. The Pandora scientists noticed that under the influence of the microwave beam, the chimpanzees lost their internal clock. In one test, the animal was trained to wait exactly 10 seconds after a light flashed before pulling a lever. If it pulled too early, no reward. If it pulled too late, no reward. Before the signal, the chimps were accurate to within a fraction of a second. Once the beam was turned on, their timing fell apart. Some pulled the lever immediately, thinking 10 seconds had passed. Others waited for a minute, frozen, thinking only a few seconds had gone by. The signal was warping their temporal processing. It was speeding up and slowing down their reality. Think about what this means for a human being. If your perception of time is off, you cannot organize your day. You cannot follow a conversation. A sentence spoken to you seems to hang in the air for too long, or rush by too fast to catch. This matched the reports coming from the Moscow embassy. Staff members described meetings that seemed to drag on for eternity. They described losing hours of their day, looking at the clock and realizing it was 4 p.m. When they thought it was noon. They thought they were just tired. The chimpanzee experiments proved they were being chronologically disjointed. The beam was acting like a temporal jammer. As the weeks turned into months, the psychological effects began to bleed into the physical. You cannot stress a brain forever without the body paying the price. The chimpanzees began to get sick. It started with their eyes. The lens of the eye is particularly sensitive to microwaves because it has no blood flow to cool it down. Even at low power, The constant vibration of the water molecules in the eye caused proteins to denature. The chimpanzees developed early-onset cataracts. Their vision blurred. The world became a hazy, indistinct place. Then came the blood work. Just like the diplomats, the chimps showed massive spikes in white blood cells. Their bodies were fighting a war against an enemy that wasn't there. The bone marrow, sensing the constant electromagnetic assault, went into overdrive. It flooded the bloodstream with lymph. The spleen enlarged. The lymph nodes swelled. The scientists recorded all of this with cold, clinical precision. They drew blood every morning. They measured the size of the tumors that began to form. They noted the weight loss. And yet, they did not stop the beam. The protocol required termination points. They needed to know how far the damage would go. Would the animal recover if the signal stopped? Or was the damage permanent? To find out, they had to push some subjects to the breaking point. There are logs that describe chimpanzees simply giving up. They stopped solving puzzles. They stopped eating. They curled into the fetal position and refused to interact with the world. This state is known as learned helplessness. It occurs when a subject realizes that nothing they do can change their situation. The scientists realized that the Moscow signal was the ultimate tool for inducing learned helplessness. If you can make a person feel sick, confused, and tired, no matter where they go or what they do, eventually they will stop fighting. They will become passive. They will accept their fate. This was the strategic goal the analysts had feared. The Soviets weren't trying to kill the Americans. They were trying to break their will. The man driving these experiments was Richard Cesaro, the head of Project Pandora. To him, the chimpanzee cage was a crystal ball. He looked at the suffering animals and saw the future of warfare. Cesaro's memos from this period are chilling. He wasn't horrified by the results. He was fascinated. He began to propose bigger, more ambitious tests. He wanted to know if the signal could be targeted. Could you hit one specific chimp in a group without affecting the others? Could you beam rage into a crowd? The chimpanzee experiments moved from replication to innovation. They began to test different frequencies. They found that certain ultra-low frequencies caused nausea. Others caused a loss of balance. The laboratory became a house of invisible horrors. In one room, a chimp was spinning in circles, its inner ear disrupted by the beam. In another, a chimp was catatonic, stuck in a deep theta trance. And all the while, the data was being cross-referenced with the medical files from Moscow. Subject A exhibits loss of motor control. Compare with ambassador's stumbling incident on October 14th. Subject B exhibits sudden aggression. Compare with security officers' fight in the cafeteria. The correlation was perfect. The chimps were mirroring the men. Imagine standing in that lab. The hum of the equipment is constant. The smell of the animals is heavy in the air. You are holding a clipboard. You look through the glass at a creature that looks terrifyingly like you. It is pressing its hand against its head, as if trying to push away a sound only it can hear. You write down the time. You write down the voltage. You turn off the lights and go home to your family. This compartmentalization is the only way Project Pandora could exist. The scientists had to believe they were doing this for defense. They had to believe that by hurting these animals, they were saving American lives. But the tragedy is that the data didn't save anyone. The embassy staff were not evacuated. The beam in Moscow was not stopped. The chimpanzees suffered in Maryland, so that the government could confirm what they already knew. The signal works. The most profound discovery of the chimpanzee experiments was that the brain has a backdoor. Before Pandora, it was believed that the only way to influence the brain was through the senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, or through chemicals like drugs. The chimpanzee trials proved there was a third way. Direct electromagnetic coupling. The brain is an electrochemical engine. It generates a field. The scientists discovered that if you generate a stronger field outside the head, the brain will naturally entrain or sync up with it. It is like placing two pendulum clocks on a wall. Eventually, they will swing in perfect rhythm. The Moscow signal was a giant pendulum. The diplomats' brains were the smaller clocks. When the chimpanzees were exposed to the signal, their EEG's brainwave scans showed this synchronization. The chaos of their natural thoughts was overridden by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the machine. They were being driven. This loss of cognitive autonomy is the ultimate nightmare of the archive chill. It means that your thoughts might not be your own. The fatigue you feel might be broadcast. The confusion you feel might be engineered. The chimpanzees couldn't speak, so they couldn't tell the scientists what it felt like, but their behavior spoke volumes. They would often cover their ears, even though there was no sound. They would rub their temples. They would exhibit signs of a migraine. The Frey effect microwave hearing was likely torturing them. a constant clicking, buzzing, or hissing inside the skull that no amount of screaming could drown out. For a wild animal, or even a trained one, this unexplainable noise is a source of absolute terror. By 1969, the chimpanzee experiments were winding down, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. The results were dangerous. If the public found out that the government had proven the existence of a mind control weapon, the panic would be uncontrollable. If the results were published, the Soviet Union would know that the US had cracked the code. The findings were buried. The final report of Project Pandora was a masterpiece of ambiguity. It used phrases like potential interaction and statistically marginal. It downplayed the horror of the cages. The chimpanzees were euthanized or transferred. The lab was scrubbed. The echo-absorbent foam was torn from the walls, but the knowledge didn't disappear. It went into the black budget. The Pandora Protocols became the foundation for the next 50 years of non-lethal weapons research. The specific frequencies that made the chimpanzees vomit, those became crowd dispersal weapons. The frequencies that made them sleep, those became classified interrogation tools. The chimpanzees were the pioneers of a new map of the human mind, a map of vulnerabilities. The legacy of these experiments is still with us. Every time you hear about Havana Syndrome, you are hearing the echo of the chimpanzee trials. The symptoms are the same: the confusion, the nausea, the inability to focus. The diplomats in Havana described the sensation of stepping into a beam. They described the pressure. It is the exact same pressure that the chimpanzees felt in 1966. The technology has improved. The signal is cleaner, more focused, harder to detect. But the biology hasn't changed. We are still the same electrochemical machines we were then, and we are just as vulnerable. But chimpanzee experiments proved that the weapon was real. They proved it was biological. They proved it was psychological. But a chimpanzee cannot tell you about the nightmares. A chimpanzee cannot describe the specific, metallic taste that appears in the mouth when the beam is active. It cannot describe the fog that descends on a Tuesday afternoon, wiping out the memory of the morning. To understand the subjective experience of the Moscow signal, the horror of living inside it, we must leave the laboratory and return to the embassy. We must listen to the voices of the people who were there. We must look at the diaries of the wives who watched their husbands fade away. We must look at the medical complaints of the secretaries who woke up with their pillows covered in hair. The chimpanzees gave us the data. The humans gave us the tragedy. The symptoms were no longer theoretical. They were spreading through the cafeteria, the typing pool, and the ambassador's residence like a contagion. The file we open next is not about monkeys in cages. It is about the Moscow fog, the specific, terrifying collection of symptoms that convinced the staff they were losing their minds, long before they knew they were losing their lives. The animal trials were over. The human trials were just entering their deadliest phase. The most effective prison is not one made of bars and concrete. It is one made of confusion. If you can make a prisoner doubt their own mind, if you can make them question their memory, their perception of time, and their ability to think, you do not need to lock the door. They are trapped inside their own head. In the mid-1960s, the staff of the US Embassy in Moscow began to experience a collective unraveling. It wasn't a sudden illness. It wasn't a plague that swept through the dormitories. It was quieter than that. It was a slow, creeping haze that settled over the building like the heavy winter snow outside. Brilliant diplomats, men and women trained to handle the highest levels of stress, began to falter. They forgot names. They lost their train of thought in the middle of sentences. They felt a strange, oppressive weight pressing against their temples. They called it the Moscow fog. They joked about it in the cafeteria. They blamed the long winters, the isolation, the vodka. But the file we open tonight reveals that the fog wasn't weather. It wasn't stress. It was a frequency. It was the biological result of the human brain being bathed in a 2.5 gigahertz electromagnetic field for 12 hours a day. The symptoms they felt were not defects of character. They were the calculated side effects of an invisible weapon. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The air in the room is thick. It tastes metallic, like holding a penny on your tongue. The only sound is the low, oscillating drone of the ventilation system, recycling the same stale air. The file in front of us is filled with medical reports, handwritten complaints, and personnel reviews. The paper is brittle, and the ink records the slow disintegration of the sharpest minds in the Foreign Service. Let us walk the hallways of that embassy. It is 1966. The Cold War is frozen solid. Inside the building, the lights are always on. The walls are thick, designed to keep secrets in and spies out. But walls cannot stop a waveform. To understand the Moscow fog, we must first understand the baseline. The people sent to Moscow were the elite. To get a posting in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, you had to be the best. You had to have a photographic memory for faces and names. You had to be fluent in Russian. You had to be psychologically ironclad, able to withstand constant surveillance and pressure. These were not people prone to brain fog. They were mental athletes. Yet, within months of arriving in Moscow, their performance began to degrade. The first symptom was the latency. It was a slight delay between thought and action. A diplomat would reach for a pen, but his hand would hesitate for a fraction of a second. A translator would hear a Russian phrase, understand it, but struggle to find the English equivalent. It was as if the internal wiring of the brain had developed resistance. The signal was traveling, but it was hitting static. Then came the fatigue. This wasn't the tiredness of a long day's work. It was a pathological exhaustion. Staff members described it as wading through glue. They would wake up after 8 hours of sleep feeling heavier than when they went to bed. They would sit at their desks at 10 a.m., fighting the overwhelming urge to lay their heads down on the typewriter keys. The archive chill comes from knowing the cause. We know now, from the Project Pandora files, that the microwave beam was pulsing at frequencies designed to induce a theta state, the brainwave state of deep relaxation and sleep. The Soviets were literally broadcasting sleep into the building. The staff were fighting a physiological war every minute they were at their desks. Their conscious minds were trying to work, to draft cables, to analyze intelligence. But their brainstorms were being told, over and over again, thousands of times a second, sleep, relax, shut down. This conflict, the fight between the will to work and the signal to sleep, created the fog. As the exposure continued, the symptoms became more specific and more bizarre. There was the pressure. Staff, working in the Chancellor's office, in the beam's path, reported a sensation of pressure behind the eyes and in the ears. It wasn't painful, exactly. It was intrusive. It felt like descending in an airplane, but the ears never popped. It was a constant low-level compression of the skull. Then there was the metallic taste. This is one of the classic markers of radio frequency exposure. The microwave energy interacts with the fillings in teeth and the chemistry of the saliva, creating a distinct, acrid taste. Secretaries would complain that the water in the coolers tasted like iron. They would switch to bottled water, but the taste remained. It wasn't in the water. It was in their mouths. And then there was the irritability. The fog didn't just make people tired. It made them angry. Short tempers became the norm. Arguments would break out over trivial things: a missing stapler, a cold cup of coffee. The emotional regulation centers of the brain were being frayed. In the closed ecosystem of the embassy, this was disastrous. Paranoia began to set in. People started to suspect each other. Why is he looking at me like that? Did she move my files? The signal was turning the staff against each other. It was creating a hostile work environment, not through policy, but through physics. When these symptoms became unmanageable, the staff did what any employee would do. They went to the doctor. The U.S. Embassy had a medical unit. It was staffed by competent American doctors, but these doctors were operating in the dark, or worse, they were operating under the do not warn protocol. Imagine the scene. A young cipher clerk walks into the medical office. He is pale. His hands are shaking. He says, "Doctor, I can't think. I feel like my head is full of cotton. I can't remember the codes I've used for 3 years, and I hear a buzzing sound at night." The doctor listens. He checks the clerk's blood pressure. It's a little high. He checks his temperature. Normal. He looks at the clerk and gives the diagnosis that became the mantra of the Moscow embassy. "It's just cabin fever. You're working too hard," the doctor says. "The winters here are long. You're not getting enough sunlight. You're stressed about the KGB following you. Take some vitamins. Get some exercise. You'll be fine." The clerk leaves the office, feeling foolish. He tells himself it's all in his head. He tries to push through, but it's not in his head. Or rather, it is, but it's not psychological. It's electromagnetic. This medical gaslighting is a key component of the trauma. The staff were told that their physical suffering was a mental weakness. They were told to toughen up. Meanwhile, the doctor files a report. That report is sent to Washington, and in Washington, the analysts at Project Pandora nod their heads. Subject exhibits cognitive decline consistent with 2.5 GHz exposure. Continue monitoring. The patient is dismissed. The data is kept. The fog had a way of erasing the edges of reality. The most terrifying symptom wasn't the pain. It was the forgetfulness. We rely on our memory to define who we are. We know our schedule. We know our duties. But under the beam, the sequence of time began to dissolve. There are reports of officers walking from their office to the secure Volta walk of perhaps 50 feet, and forgetting why they were going there by the time they arrived. They would stand in the hallway, blinking, trying to grasp a thought that had just evaporated. That this is known as short-term memory dump. The microwave signal disrupts the consolidation of memory in the hippocampus. The thought is formed, but it is never written to the hard drive. It just vanishes. For an intelligence officer, this is correct. If you cannot hold a secret in your head, you are useless. Many careers ended quietly in Moscow during these years. Promising officers were sent home early, stamped with failure to adapt or psychological instability. They returned to Washington thinking they had failed. They spent the rest of their lives wondering why they broke down. They never knew. They were being jammed. The fog also affected the senses. The visual field would sometimes blur. Staff members reported seeing halos around lights. They reported that the fluorescent lights in the ceiling seemed to flicker in rhythm with the pressure in their heads. This was likely a real perception. The pulsing of the microwave beam could induce a strobing effect in the visual cortex. They were seeing the weapon firing, translated into light by their own brains. The Moscow fog did not respect the boundary between work and home. The embassy compound included apartments. Families lived there. Wives raised children there. The beam hit the apartments too. The diaries of the wives from this period paint a haunting picture. Women who were normally active and social became withdrawn. They stopped hosting dinner parties. They stopped going out into the city. They spent days lying on the sofa, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed by a lethargy they couldn't explain. They watched their husbands come home from work, gray-faced and silent. They watched their children become cranky and listless. Their children were the most vulnerable. Their developing brains were more susceptible to the frequency. There were reports of learning difficulties. Children who had been bright students suddenly struggled to read. They couldn't focus on their homework. They complained of the noise in their ears. Mothers took their children to the embassy nurse. "He's just not himself," they would say. And again the answer was the same. "It's the environment. It's a hard city for a child. He's just adjusting." The fog created a shroud of depression over the entire community. It was a collective malaise, a shared heavins. And underneath the depression there was the sound. We must talk about the sound. Not everyone heard it. It depended on the shape of your skull and the sensitivity of your hearing. But for those who did, it was a form of torture. It wasn't a loud noise. It was described as a hiss, a buzz, a click. Some compared it to the sound of sand being poured on paper. Others compared it to the hum of a high-tension wire. It came from nowhere. You couldn't block it out with earplugs, because the sound wasn't entering through the ear canal. The microwaves were vibrating the soft tissue inside the head. The sound was originating inside the brain. Imagine lying in bed at night, in the silence of the Moscow winter, trying to sleep, and in the center of your head, there is a rhythmic click-click. It matches the beat of the machine across the street. It keeps you awake. It makes you focus on it. And the more you focus on it, the louder it seems to get. This sleep deprivation was a force multiplier for the fog. A brain that cannot sleep cannot heal. The toxins build up. The confusion deepens. The staff were trapped in a cycle, irradiated during the day, kept awake by the buzz at night. The environment itself seemed to react to the beam. The embassy was known for its static electricity. Microwaves ionize the air. They strip electrons from molecules. This created a highly charged atmosphere inside the building. Staff reported that they would get shocked constantly, touching a doorknob, shaking hands, picking up a metal a spark would jump. The air felt dry and brittle. Papers would stick together. Hair would stand on end. It gave the building a haunted quality. The air felt alive. It felt watched. Technicians noticed that electronics behaved strangely. Radios would pick up ghost voices. Televisions would fuzz out with interference patterns that matched the pulsing of the beam. The physical world was glitched, and the people living inside the glitch were beginning to question their own reality. Why create the fog? If we analyze the symptoms, fatigue, confusion, irritability, memory loss, we see a pattern. These are not the symptoms of a weapon designed to kill. They are the symptoms of a weapon designed to disable. The Soviets didn't want dead Americans. Dead Americans are martyrs. They create international incidents. The Soviets wanted incompetent Americans. They wanted a CIA station chief who was too tired to double-check a source. They wanted a negotiator who was too irritable to build a rapport with his counterpart. They wanted a cipher clerk who was foggy enough to make a mistake with a one-time pad. The Moscow fog was a weapon of attrition. It was designed to lower the IQ of the embassy by 10 points. to reduce the efficiency of the operation by 20%. It was a soft kill, and it worked. Looking back at the cables sent from Moscow during the peak years of the signal, historians have noted a certain flatness, a lack of nuance. The analysis was often reactive, sluggish. The beam was effectively dampening the intelligence of the United States forward operating base. Let's go deeper into the neuroscience of the fog. The Project Pandora. Scientists believed the signal was affecting the latency. A synapse is the gap between two neurons. For a thought to happen, a chemical signal must jump that gap. The microwave field created a noise floor in the brain. It raised the threshold required for the signal to jump. It meant that the brain had to work harder to think. It burned more glucose. It used more oxygen. This explains the physical exhaustion. Thinking literally became a heavy lifting exercise. The brain was running a marathon just to write a memo. This metabolic stress leads to the buildup of waste products in the brain. Usually, these are cleared out during deep sleep, but since the signal also disrupted sleep, the waste remained. The fog was essentially a toxic buildup, a neurological pollution. The most insidious part of the fog was the fear of insanity. When you cannot remember your wife's birthday, or you fly into a rage because the coffee is cold, you start to worry about yourself. You worry you are having a breakdown. You worry you are developing early dementia. In the 1960s, mental health was stigmatized. If you admitted you were struggling, your security clearance was pulled. You were sent home. Your career was over. So, the staff hid their symptoms. They masked the fog. They smiled through the exhaustion. They wrote notes to themselves to remember simple tasks. They suffered in silence to protect their jobs. This silence played right into the hands of the Do Not Warn protocol. The government didn't have to hush it up, because the victims were hushing it up themselves. The fog created a culture of denial. Everyone was feeling it, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. It was a perfect conspiracy of silence, enforced by the biology of the weapon itself. There was one telltale sign that proved it wasn't just stress. Staff members noticed that when they left the embassy, when they went on a trip to Helsinki or London, the fog lifted. Within 48 hours of leaving Moscow, the headaches vanished. The energy returned. The memory sharpened. The metallic taste disappeared. They felt like themselves again, but then they would return to Moscow. They would walk through the heavy doors of the embassy, and within an hour the weight would return. The pressure would clamp down on their skull. The fog would roll in. This on-off effect was the smoking gun. It proved the sickness was tied to the location. It was tied to the building. The building was the disease. The Moscow fog was a subjective experience. It was feelings, sensations, and lost memories. It was easy for the government to dismiss it as psychosomatic. It's all in your head, they said. And for a long time the staff believed them. They believed they were weak. They believed they were cracking under the pressure. But the body keeps the score. While the mind was confused, the blood was telling the truth. The fog was not just a cloud in the mind. It was a storm in the marrow. The confusion was the early warning system of a much deeper biological collapse. The doctors who were dismissing the headaches were also drawing blood samples, and in those samples they were seeing something that couldn't be explained by stress or winter blues. They were seeing the cells themselves reacting to the invasion. The fog was about to become tangible. It was about to become measurable. And the file we open next moves from the psychology of confusion to the pathology of destruction. The staff thought they were losing their minds. The microscope revealed they were losing their chromosomes. The symptoms were dismissed. But the blood samples could not be ignored. The evidence is on the slide. The most dangerous secrets are not the ones hidden in safes or encrypted in digital codes. The most dangerous secrets are the ones flowing through your own veins. You can burn a document. You can erase a tape. You can silence a witness. But you cannot silence biology. The body keeps a ledger of everything done to it, written in the ink of its own blood cells. For nearly a decade, the staff of the US Embassy in Moscow were told that their headaches, their fatigue, and their confusion was psychological. They were told it was the stress of the Cold War. They were told they were imagining the invisible beam coming from the balcony across the street. But in the quiet, sterile laboratories of the State Department Medical Division, the microscope was telling a different story. The blood drawn from the arms of these diplomats did not look like the blood of stressed-out office workers. It looked like the blood of people who had been standing near a nuclear reactor. It looked like the blood of cancer patients. The file we open tonight contains the medical evidence that the government tried to bury. It is a file filled with charts, white blood cell counts, and the terrifying discovery of a mutated anomaly that had no name, until they realized the source. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The environment is clinical. The light is harsh and white, reflecting off the stainless steel The air smells of antiseptic and fear. We are looking through the lens of a high-powered microscope. On the glass slide, a drop of blood is smeared into a thin, red film. It is a landscape of cells, frozen in time. To the untrained eye, it looks like a scattering of red dots, but to the hematologist, it is a crime scene. In the mid-1960s, the State Department began a routine program of medical monitoring for its overseas staff. It was standard procedure. A checkup before you leave, a checkup when you return. They measured blood pressure, heart rate, and cholesterol. But for the staff returning from Moscow, the doctors noticed a statistical aberration. It wasn't one person. It wasn't two. It was dozens. The anomaly was in the white blood cells, the lymphocytes. These cells are the soldiers of the immune system. They patrol the bloodstream, hunting for viruses, bacteria, and foreign invaders. In a healthy adult, the count is stable. But in the Moscow staff, the lymphocyte count was skyrocketing. It was 40% higher than the average for staff in London or Paris. The doctors were baffled. A high lymphocyte count usually means the body is fighting an active infection, mononucleosis, the flu, or perhaps early-stage leukemia. But these patients didn't have a fever. They didn't have swollen glands. They felt tired, yes, but they didn't look sick in the traditional sense. Their bodies were mobilizing for war, but there was no enemy to fight. Or at least, no biological enemy. The doctors marked the charts, lymphocytosis of unknown origin. They sent the samples to the lab for further analysis. They wanted to look closer at the cells themselves, and that is where the archive chill truly sets in. When they magnified the lymphocytes, they saw that the cells were not just numerous, they were damaged. The cell walls were jagged. The nuclei were misshapen. And deep inside the cell, the chromosomes, the twisted ladders of DNA that hold the blueprint of life, were breaking. Chromosomal breakage is a terrifying phrase in medicine. It means the genetic code is snapping apart. It is usually seen in victims of radiation poisoning, people exposed to X-rays or gamma rays. But the Moscow signal was not ionizing radiation. It was microwave radiation. According to the physics of the 1960s, microwaves shouldn't be able to break DNA. They didn't have enough energy to knock electrons out of orbit. Yet, there it was on the slide. The Project Pandora scientists, working in secret, offered a chilling explanation. It was resonance. Imagine a wine glass. If you sing a note at the right frequency, the glass will vibrate. If you sing loud enough, the glass will shatter. The theory was that the 2.5 GHz signal was the resonant frequency of the DNA strand itself. The microwave beam wasn't burning the DNA, it was shaking it. It was vibrating the genetic ladder billions of times a second until the rungs simply snapped. The blood of the embassy staff was being shaken apart at the molecular level. This was the mutated blood. It was a new kind of injury, never before seen in medical history. It was a microwave signature. Enter Dr. Herbert Pollack. In every cover-up, there is a man whose job it is to explain away the unexplainable. Dr. Pollack was a distinguished physician, a contract consultant for the State Department. He was brought in to review the Moscow medical data. He saw the charts. He saw the high white blood cell counts. He saw the chromosomal damage. And then, he did something extraordinary. He redefined normal. Dr. Pollack issued a classified report stating that the blood counts of the Moscow staff were within acceptable variations. He argued that the high lymphocyte count was likely due to a local microbial agent, a mysterious Moscow virus that didn't make you sick, just changed your blood. He created a medical fiction to hide a physical fact. He told the staff, "Don't worry, it's just something going around. It's the water, it's the food." But behind the scenes, Pollack was reporting the truth to the CIA. He became the gatekeeper of the biological data. He separated the files into two piles. Pile A, the patient copy. This file showed everything as normal. It was given to the diplomat to show their family doctor back home. Pile B, the shadow copy. This file contained the real data, the mutation rates, the cancer markers. This file was stamped notice and locked in a safe in Washington. This dual filing system is one of the most cynical acts in the history of the scandal. It meant that if a diplomat later developed leukemia, which many didn't, went to their doctor, the doctor would look at the patient copy and say, "Well, your history looks clean. This cancer must be random bad luck." The doctor would never know to look for radiation damage, because the record of that damage had been redacted from the medical history. The mutation was erased from the record, but it remained in the body. The blood is made in the marrow. Deep inside the long bones of the legs and the hips, the body operates a factory. It produces red cells to carry oxygen and white cells to fight infection. The mutated blood samples suggested that the factory itself was under attack. The Project Pandora analysts realized that the microwave signal penetrates deep into the body. It passes through skin and muscle. It reaches the bone. When the bone marrow is stressed by a constant electromagnetic field, it panics. It goes into overdrive. It starts pumping out immature cells that aren't fully formed yet. This is what the doctors were seeing on the slides. Blast cells, baby white blood cells, released too early because the body felt it was under siege. For the staff living in the embassy, this meant they were in a state of chronic biological exhaustion. Their bodies were running a marathon 24 hours a day, while sitting in a desk chair. This explains the Moscow fog we discussed earlier. The brain was tired because the body was starving for resources. All the energy was going to the marrow, trying to repair the damage that the beam was causing every second. Imagine being a nurse in that embassy. You draw blood from a young Marine guard. He is 22 years old, fit, strong. He plays basketball on the embassy court. You put his blood in the centrifuge. You spin it down. You look at the separation. The buffy coat, the layer of white blood cells is too thick. It's a milky white band that shouldn't be that wide. You know what that usually means. It usually means leukemia. But you have been told by Dr. Pollock that it's normal for this post. So you write normal on the chart. You hand the paper to the Marine. He smiles and walks out. You know you have just lied to him, but you have signed a secrecy agreement, and you know that if you tell him the truth, he will be sent home, his career will be ruined, and you will be fired, so you stay silent. And the centrifuge spins again. Voice cue shift to the comparison group logic. The scientific method applied to human suffering. To prove that the blood mutations were caused by the signal, the government needed a control group. In a scientific experiment, you need two groups, one that gets the drug, and one that gets the placebo. The Moscow embassy was the test group. They were getting the signal, but who was the placebo? The State Department selected other embassies in Iron Curtain countries: Warsaw, Prague, Budapest. These embassies were similar in construction, similar in climate, similar in stress, but they didn't have a microwave beam pointed at them. They drew blood from the staff in Warsaw. They drew blood from the staff in Prague. They compared the samples. The difference was stark. The staff in Warsaw had normal blood counts. The staff in Prague were healthy. Only in Moscow. In the building with the 2.5 gigahertz humded the blood show the mutation. This was the smoking gun. It proved that the Moscow virus didn't exist. It proved it wasn't the food or the water. It was the beam. Did they release this study? No, they classified it. The comparative blood study of 1967 remains one of the most heavily redacted documents in the archive. They buried the proof because the proof was a liability. If they admitted the blood was different, they admitted the beam was a weapon. And if they admitted it was a weapon, they had to explain why they left their people in the line of fire. The scientists were struggling with a paradox. The blood looked like it had been cooked, but the temperature of the body hadn't risen. This challenged everything they knew about biology. They began to look at the cell membranes, the skin of the cell. They found that the microwave signal was altering the permeability of the cell wall. It was making the cells leaky. Calcium ions, which are crucial for cell signaling, were leaking out of the cells. This disruption of calcium flow is catastrophic. It prevents the cell from communicating with its neighbors. It creates a cellular silence. The blood cells were there, but they weren't talking to each other. They were isolated, deaf, and blind. This mirrored the psychological isolation of the staff. The biology was reflecting the sociology, a breakdown of communication at the microscopic level leading to a breakdown of function at the macroscopic level. The blood samples didn't just come from the men in suits. They came from the dependents. The wives, the children. The mutated blood file contains pediatric charts. Children who lived in the embassy compound showed the same lymphocyte tissues as their fathers. A 6-year-old child should not have the blood profile of a radiation worker. But in Moscow, they did. There were reports of women suffering from strange gynecological issues, irregular cycles, miscarriages. The blood work hinted at a disruption of the endocrine system, the hormones. The microwave signal wasn't just hitting the bone marrow, it was hitting the pituitary gland. It was disrupting the master clock of the body. The government told these women it was stress. They were told that living in a communist country was hard on the female constitution. It was a patronizing, sexist dismissal of a radiological assault. The most haunting part of the medical evidence is the latency period. Blood damage doesn't always show up immediately as cancer. It can sit there, dormant, for years. The broken chromosomes replicate, passing the error down to the next generation of cells. It is a ticking clock. The staff would leave Moscow. Their blood counts would return to normal on the surface. The lymphocytes would drop. The fog would lift. They thought they were cured, but the genetic damage was done. The error was written into the code. 10 years later, 15 years later, that is when the bill came due. Former ambassadors, former clerks, they began to get sick, lymphoma, leukemia, brain tumors. When they went to their doctors in America, the doctors asked, "Have you ever been exposed to radiation?" The patients said, "No, I was just a diplomat," because they didn't know. The patient copy of their medical file said they were clean. The connection between the tumor in 1985 and the balcony in 1965 was severed by the paperwork. The blood evidence eventually became too loud to ignore, and the man who forced the issue was the ambassador himself, Walter Stossel. Stossel was a giant of diplomacy, a disciplined, loyal servant of the state. He didn't complain, but his blood began to fail him. In the mid-1970s, Stossel developed a rare blood disorder. His platelets, the cells that clot the blood, began to vanish. He started getting nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. His eyes became bloodshot, the capillaries bursting. He looked like a man who was bleeding from the inside out. He went to the embassy doctor. "What is happening to me?" The doctor, bound by the protocol, hesitated. Stossel demanded to see his real file. He demanded to know about the signal. This was the cracking point. The blood of the ambassador was on the desk of the Secretary of State. You can hide the blood count of a junior clerk. You cannot hide the bleeding eyes of the ambassador. Stossel's illness forced the government to admit, finally, that the Moscow virus was a lie. The blood samples from Moscow are still studied today in secret. They provided the first clear evidence that non-ionizing radiation like microwaves, Wi-Fi, cell phones can have biological effects. Before Moscow, science said it was impossible. After Moscow, they knew it was real, but instead of using this knowledge to protect the public, they classified it. They realized that if they admitted that low-level microwaves cause blood mutations, they would have to regulate the entire electronics industry. They would have to redesign radar systems. The economic cost was too high, so the mutated blood theory was officially debunked. Pollux virus theory remained the official story for decades. The truth was locked in the shadow copy of the file. The microscope slide is put back in the box. The refrigerator hums. The blood told the truth, but no one listened. The cells screamed, but the doctors remained silent. The tragedy of the mutated samples is not just that they were ignored, it is that they were used as a learning tool rather than a warning siren. The scientists learned exactly how much radiation a human being can absorb before their chromosomes snap. They learnt the precise recipe for breaking the immune system, and while the clerks and the secretaries carried this invisible damage home with them, one man was left behind to face the full force of the beam. He was the man at the top. The man whose office was the bullseye. While the staff suffered, Ambassador Walter Stossel was dying, and his death would finally force the United States to acknowledge the weapon. The file we open next is not about statistics, it is about a specific death. It is about the moment when the Cold War became hot, and the blood finally spilled. The charts were hidden, but the symptoms were about to become visible to the whole world. The ambassador is falling dot in the architecture of a government. The ambassador is the keystone. He is the physical embodiment of the nation he represents. When he speaks, it is the voice of the president. When he stands on sovereign ground. He is protected by treaties, by international law, and by the immense power of the state behind him. But in the story of the Moscow signal, the ambassador was not a protected figure. He was a target, and not just a target for the enemy, but a target for his own superiors. Walter Stossel was a man of the old school, disciplined, loyal, a quiet giant of American diplomacy who believed that service meant sacrifice. When he accepted the post in Moscow, he knew he was walking into the cold heart of the enemy. He expected surveillance. He expected bugs in the walls. He expected the psychological pressure of the KGB. What he did not expect was that his own office chair had been positioned in the center of an invisible crosshair. He did not know that for years. He would be sitting in the focal point of a microwave beam that was slowly unraveling his DNA. His death was not immediate. It was a slow, agonizing erasure. It was a death caused by a weapon that officially did not exist, inflicted by an enemy who denied firing it, and covered up by a government that refused to name it. The file on his death is not just a medical record, it is an indictment. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The scene is a cemetery in winter. The grass is frosted with ice. The sky is the color of slate. The only sound is the wind moving through the bare branches of the oak trees, a dry rattling whisper. A black car sits idling on the gravel road, its exhaust curling into the cold air. Inside the car, a file rests on the leather seat. It contains the autopsy report of a man who died twice, once when his government betrayed him, and again when his body finally gave out. Let us step into the quiet room of history and examine the end of a career that should have been celebrated, but was instead silenced. Walter Stossel arrived in Moscow in 1974. He was a man at the peak of his powers. He was tall, soft-spoken, and possessed an intellect that intimidated even the Soviets. He was the perfect man for the job during the era of date. He was there to build bridges, but the office he inherited, the Chancellor's office on the 10th floor, came with a secret legacy. For 20 years, the Soviet signal from the balcony across the street had been tuning that specific room. The engineers had calculated the angles perfectly. The beam entered through the window, passed through the wooden desk, and focused its energy directly on the chair where the ambassador sat for 12 to 14 hours a day. Stossel was a workaholic. He believed that if he worked harder he could solve the problems between the superpowers. So he sat in the beam, he read cables in the beam, he ate his lunch in the beam. He was absorbing more radiation than anyone else in the building. He was the ground zero of the Moscow signal. The symptoms began subtly. It started with the eyes. Stossel began to complain of a gritty sensation, like sand under his eyelids. He would rub his eyes, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then came the redness. The capillaries in the whites of his eyes began to burst. He looked perpetually tired, his eyes framed by dark, bruised circles. The embassy doctor, bound by the do not warn protocol, told him it was the dry heating system. He prescribed eye drops, but eye drops cannot fix cellular damage. The microwaves were heating the fluid in his eyes, causing a low-level inflammation that never healed. Then came the blood. Stossel began to suffer from nosebleeds that were difficult to stop. He would be in the middle of a briefing, and suddenly a drop of bright red blood would hit the paperwork. He would excuse himself, embarrassed, and go to the washroom to press a handkerchief to his face. These were not normal nosebleeds. They were a sign of thrombocytopenia disorder where the blood loses its ability to clot. His platelet count was crashing. The bone marrow, exhausted by the constant electromagnetic assault, was failing to produce the cells needed to keep him alive. The tragedy of Walter Stossel is that he didn't complain. He was a stoic. He believed that a diplomat does not whine about his health. He hid his symptoms from his staff. He wore dark glasses to hide his bleeding eyes. He carried extra handkerchiefs. He internalized the pain, just as he internalized the secrets of his office. But the signal didn't just attack the body. It attacked the mind. Stossel began to feel the Moscow fog. The sharp, crystalline intellect that had served him for 30 years began to dull. He found himself struggling to remember the details of conversations. He felt a profound, crushing fatigue that sleep could not fix. He worried he was losing his edge. He worried he was failing his country. He didn't know that his brain was fighting a battle against a 2.5 GHz jammer. The Soviet, watching from across the street, likely knew exactly what was happening. They could see the lights on in his office. They could see the beam intensity on their own monitors. They were watching a slow-motion assassination. And in Washington, the men who knew Henry Kissinger, the CIA directors, read the report. They knew Stossel was sick. They saw the medical cables, but they kept him there. Why? Because Stossel was effective. He was getting the job done. And to remove him would be to admit the problem. To evacuate the ambassador would be to signal to the Soviets that the US had blinked. So they let him stay. They sacrificed the man to save the mission. The breaking point came in 1975. Stossel's health had deteriorated so badly that he could barely function. He was suffering from severe nausea and vertigo. He finally demanded a full briefing. He cornered the embassy security officers. He asked a question that had been forbidden. Is there something in this building that is making me sick? The security officers, seeing the state of their boss, finally broke protocol. They told him about the balcony. They told him about the beam. Stossel was stunned. He wasn't angry. He was heartbroken. He realized that the government he had served for his entire adult life had let him sit in a microwave oven for 2 years without a word of warning. He sent a cable to Washington. It was not a request. It was a demand. He threatened to resign. He threatened to go public. This cable forced Washington's hand. They couldn't afford a scandal. So, they agreed to install protective screening on the windows, the aluminum mesh we discussed earlier. But for Stossel, it was too late. The damage to his DNA was already done. The chromosomes in his blood had already snapped. The mutation was locked in. He finished his tour in Moscow. He returned to Washington. He continued to serve. He eventually became the Deputy Secretary of State, the number 2 man in the department. But the ghost of the signal followed him. The human body is resilient, but it has a breaking point. For Walter Stossel, that point arrived a few years after leaving Moscow. He was diagnosed with leukemia. Leukemia is a cancer of the blood-forming tissues. It is the classic signature of radiation exposure. It is the disease of Hiroshima survivors. It is the disease of Chernobyl liquidators. And it became the disease of the American ambassador to Moscow. That the progression was brutal. The man who had once negotiated nuclear treaties was now fighting for his own life in a hospital room. His immune system, shattered by years of exposure, collapsed. But even on his deathbed, the cover-up continued. The government refused to officially link his cancer to his service in Moscow. They called it natural causes. They called it a tragic coincidence. To admit that the ambassador died in the line of duty, killed by a Soviet weapon, would have required a response. It would have been an act of war. So, they denied him the Purple Heart. They denied him the status of a combat casualty. He died in 1986. He was 66 years old. If Stossel had been the only one, perhaps the coincidence theory would hold. But the archive reveals a terrifying pattern. Walter Stossel was not the only ambassador to die of cancer. His predecessor, Llewellyn Thompson, also died of cancer. His successor, Malcolm Tune, suffered from severe health issues. In fact, 3 consecutive U.S. ambassadors to Moscow died of or suffered from cancer-related illnesses. Statistically, this is impossible. The odds of 3 men in the same job, in the same office, developing the same types of cellular damage by chance are astronomical. This is the ambassador's curse. It suggests that the beam wasn't just background noise. It suggests that the Soviets were specifically targeting the leadership. They were headhunting. The Chancellor's office was a killbox, and the US government knew it. They kept sending men into that room, one after another, like coal into a furnace. Imagine the last days of Ambassador He is lying in a hospital bed at Walter Reed. The room is quiet. He is surrounded by flowers from heads of state. Does he think about the treaties he signed? Does he think about the speeches he gave? Or does he think about the window? Does he think about the view from his desk in Moscow? The gray sky, the snow, the beige apartment building across the street, the wooden slats of the balcony. Does he realize, in the end, that the balcony was the last thing he truly saw? The silence of his death was the final victory of the Moscow signal. It killed the witness. Stossel's death sent a shockwave through the Foreign Service. The staff who had served under him loved him. When they saw him wither and die, they knew that their own fate might be sealed. If the ambassador wasn't safe, no one was safe. It shattered the trust between the diplomats and the department. The contract was broken. People began to refuse postings to Moscow. The combat pay differential was increased, but money couldn't buy new bone marrow. The death of forced the State Department to finally launch a massive health study, the study conducted by Dr. Lilienfeld at Johns Hopkins. But even this study was compromised. As we discussed, the data was massaged. The healthy group was mixed with the sick group to dilute the results. They couldn't let Stossel's death be the proof, so they buried the statistics just as they buried the man. Walter Stossel is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His grave is marked with a simple stone. It lists his dates and his rank. It does not list the cause of death. It stands as a silent monument to the Cold War's most effective secret weapon. But a weapon requires a user, and a cover-up requires an architect. Stossel did not die simply because the Soviets fired a beam. He died because a decision was made in Washington to keep him in the chair. That decision was made by one of the most powerful and controversial figures in American history, a man who believed in realpolitik, the idea that politics is about power, not morality. To understand why Stossel had to die, we must look at the memos that crossed the desk of the Secretary of State. We must look at the handwritten notes in the margins, the orders to suppress and deny. The next file we open bears a signature that changed the world. It is the signature of Henry Kissinger. The ambassador is dead, but the man who signed the Do Not Warn order is still in power. The cover-up goes to the very top. History is often written by the victors, but the secrets are kept by the bureaucrats. In the vast machinery of the Cold War, there were men who moved armies, and there were men who moved paper. But occasionally there arises a figure who moves the world simply by deciding what is true and what is false. In the mid-1970s, the fate of the Americans trapped in the microwave beam in Moscow did not rest with the scientists in the lab, or the doctors in the hospital. It rested on the desk of one man, a man who viewed the world as a where pawns are sacrificed to save the king. Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, was the architect of détente, the easing of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. It was his masterpiece. It was the policy that prevented nuclear war. But every masterpiece requires a price, and the price for détente, it turned out, was the bone marrow of the embassy staff. The file we open tonight documents the specific moment when the health of American citizens was weighed against the geopolitical interests of the state, and found to be lighter. It is a story of phone calls, classified memos, and the cold, hard calculus of power. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The atmosphere shifts from the sterile lab to the heavy, oak-paneled rooms of Washington, D.C. The air smells of expensive cigar smoke and old leather. The light is dim, filtered through heavy velvet curtains. The only sound is the scratching of a fountain pen on thick, cream-colored stationery. It is the sound of a decision being made that will silence 100 voices. Let us step into the office of the Secretary of State. It is 1975. The world is fragile. The United States has just left Vietnam. The Soviet Union is expanding, and on the desk sits a report about a beam of energy hitting the Moscow embassy. To understand the cover-up, we must understand the philosophy of realpolitik. This is the belief that politics is based on practical and material factors rather than on theoretical or ethical objectives. In this worldview, there is no good or evil, there is only interest. Henry Kissinger was the high priest of real. His goal was to stabilize the relationship with the Soviet Union. He wanted to sign trade deals. He wanted to sign arms control treaties. He wanted to lower the temperature of the Cold War. But the Moscow signal was a problem. It was an act of aggression. If the United States publicly acknowledged that the Soviets were irradiating the embassy, they would have to retaliate. They would have to expel Soviet diplomats. They would have to cancel the trade deals. Détente would collapse. So, when the medical reports regarding Ambassador Stossel and the staff began to pile up, Kissinger faced a choice. Choice A, protect the staff, expose the beam, and risk World War III. Choice B, ignore the beam, protect the treaty, and sacrifice the staff. The memos from this period, many of which were declassified, decades later reveal the decision process. They are chilling in their lack of emotion. Kissinger did not want the staff to be hurt, but he wanted the truth to be hurt even less. He ordered a strategy of containment, not containment of the radiation, but containment of the information. When Ambassador Stossel first raised the alarm, pleading for a briefing on the health risks, the response from Washington was silence. The cables were intercepted. The replies were drafted by lawyers, not doctors. The logic was simple. If you tell them they are in danger, they will leave. If they leave, the embassy closes. If the embassy closes, the diplomatic channel is cut. Therefore, they must stay. And to keep them there, they must not know the full extent of the danger. Kissinger operated on a theory called linkage. He believed that everything was connected. You couldn't just complain about the beam. You had to think about how that complaint would affect grain shipments or missile treaties. In a famous phone conversation recorded on the Nixon secret taping system, Kissinger is heard dismissing the complaints. He refers to the issue as a minor irritant. He frames the staff's health concerns not as a medical crisis, but as a discipline problem. They are whining, was the sentiment. They are professionals. They should take it. This dismissal trickled down through the department. It created a culture where raising health concerns was seen as disloyal. If you complained about the headaches, you weren't just sick. You were You were trying to sabotage the peace process. This is the ultimate gaslight. The victims were turned into political liabilities. The cover-up involved actively suppressing the medical data we discussed earlier. When the blood studies showed the mutations, the order came down to classify them. Noticed, no distribution. This wasn't just about hiding it from the Soviets. The Soviets knew what they were doing. This was about hiding it from the American press and the American public. Kissinger knew that if the New York Times ran a headline saying Soviets zapping US ambassador with death ray, the public demand for retaliation would be unstoppable. So, he put a lid on the pot. He clamped it down tight. Imagine the frustration of the security officers in Moscow. They are the ones holding the Geiger counters. They see the needle jump every day. They send a flash cable, the highest priority, to Washington. Signal intensity increasing. Staff morale critical. Request guidance. They wait by the teletype machine. The machine clatters. The response prints out. Acknowledged. Continue monitoring. Do not escalate. Do not escalate. That was the mantra. Even as the white blood cell counts rose, even as the ambassador's eyes bled, the order remained the same. The silence was the policy. The relationship between Kissinger and Ambassador Stossel was the fulcrum of this tragedy. Stossel revered Kissinger. He was a career diplomat, and Kissinger was the star. But as Stossel's body began to fail, the reverence turned to desperation. There is a documented meeting, a moment where the two worlds collided. Stossel, gaunt and pale, finally confronted the Secretary of State. He argued that the moral obligation to the staff outweighed the diplomatic strategy, pointed out that they were bringing wives and children into the zone of fire. Kissinger's response, recorded in the historical notes of the meeting, was a masterclass in deflection. He didn't say no, he said not yet. He told Stossel that they were working on it. He told him that raising a fuss now would ruin the upcoming summit with Brezhnev. He asked Stossel to hold the line for just a little longer. For the good of the country, that phrase, for the good of the country, is the heaviest weight a soldier or diplomat can carry. It is the phrase used to justify the unjustifiable. Stossel, being a loyal soldier, went back to Moscow. He went back to the chair. He held the line, and while he held the line, the beam held its frequency. Kissinger did not act alone. He had a team. One of his key aides was Lawrence Eagleburger. The memos between them show the internal struggle. They debated the thermal versus non-thermal effects. They looked for any scientific ambiguity they could find to justify their inaction. They latched onto the scientific uncertainty like a life raft. Since the scientists couldn't prove 100% that the beam caused cancer, the State Department decided to act as if there was 0% chance it caused cancer. They used a scientific method against the victims. Correlation is not causation, they argued. This bureaucratic stalling bought them time, years of time. During those years, hundreds of new staff members rotated through Moscow. They arrived innocent. They were briefed on security, on spies, on the black market, but they were not briefed on the microwave levels in their bedrooms. They were allowed to walk into the reactor core because telling them would have been administratively difficult. The cover-up required physical storage. The files on the Moscow signal were not kept in the General Archive. They were kept in the special compartmented information facilities, the CIFs. These are rooms within rooms, shielded against electronic eavesdropping. Ironically, the files about the microwave weapon were kept in rooms designed to block microwaves. The hypocrisy is stark. The paper was protected better than the people. In these safes, the timeline of the betrayal is preserved. You can see the dates. January 1976, the signal intensity doubles. February 1976, Kissinger memo advises against public protest. March 1976, Stossel diagnosed with blood disorder. The correlation is visible on the page. Even if it was denied in the press room, but secrets of this magnitude have a heart. They decayed by 1976. The whispers were too loud. The staff were talking to journalists. The Boston Globe story was looming. Kissinger realized the lid was about to blow off. His reaction was classic. Crisis management. He didn't apologize. He preempted. He authorized a limited hangout. This is a spy term. It means you release a little bit of the truth to hide the whole truth. The State Department issued a statement acknowledging some electromagnetic signals but insisted they were harmless. They framed it as a technical curiosity, not a health hazard. They admitted the existence of the gun, but denied the existence of the bullets. This spin control allowed Kissinger to survive the scandal. He left office in 1977 with his reputation intact. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. Meanwhile, the staff he left behind in Moscow were beginning their chemotherapy. The Henry Kissinger cover-up is not just a history lesson. It is a warning about the nature of the state. It teaches us that in the eyes of a superpower, the individual is a statistic. The health of a diplomat is a line item in a budget, to be traded against grain shipments or missile silos. Kissinger wasn't a monster. He was a mathematician. He calculated that the cancer of a few dozen people was statistically less significant than the threat of nuclear war. It is a cold, rational logic, and that is why it is terrifying, because that logic still runs the world today. When we look at modern anomalies like the Havana Syndrome, we see the same pattern. The denial, the delay, the psychosomatic label, the refusal to blame a hostile power because of the diplomatic fallout. The playbook was written in 1975. In that smoke-filled office in Washington, the files from the Kissinger era are now largely declassified. You can go online and read them. You can read the handwritten notes where he dismisses the pain of his subordinates. The ink is faded, but the cynicism is still fresh. It is a reminder that the most dangerous place in the Cold War wasn't the battlefield. It was the space between the truth and the official story. The cover-up worked. Détente held, The war stayed cold, but for the families of the victims, the war was hot. It was radioactive, and it was fought in their own living rooms, waiting for a government apology that never came. With the cover-up cracking and the press sniffing around, the government had to do something. They couldn't stop the beam, and they couldn't move the embassy. So they decided to try and catch the bullets. They launched a massive engineering project. They turned the embassy into a fortress of metal mesh. It was a desperate, visible attempt to block the invisible, but as the engineers climbed the scaffolds to install the screens, they realized something terrifying. The screens blocked the view, but they didn't stop the signal. The next file we open details the failure of the defense. It is the story of the aluminum cage. The cover-up failed to hide the truth. Now, the screens would fail to hide the beam. The trap is closing. There is a desperate instinct in human nature when faced with an invisible threat. We build walls. We believe that if we can just put enough matter between us and the danger, we will be safe. We build bunkers to stop bombs. We build dams to stop floods. And in 1976, the United States government attempted to build a metal cage to stop a beam of light. It was the largest defensive retrofitting operation in diplomatic history. The plan was to wrap the US Embassy in Moscow in a skin of aluminum. They wanted to turn a 10-story building into a Faraday cage enclosure that is electromagnetically impacted. They believed that if they covered the windows with heavy wire mesh, the microwave signal from the balcony across the street would bounce off, leaving the diplomats inside safe in a bubble of silence. But physics is a cruel mistress. It does not care about budgets, or political desperation, or the thickness of a wire. It cares about wavelengths. And the file we open tonight reveals the catastrophic failure of this defense. It documents how the aluminum curtain did not stop the beam, but instead trapped the staff inside a prison of their own making, darkening their rooms and their spirits, while the radiation simply flowed through the gaps. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The sound of the embassy changed in 1976. Before, it was the sound of typewriters and voices. Now, it was the sound of construction. The exterior of the building became a hive of activity. Workmen hung from scaffolds, drilling into the beige stone. They carried rolls of dark, heavy mesh, thousands of square feet of aluminum screening. The light inside the offices began to dim. The view of the Moscow skyline, the onion domes, the snow, the street life was slowly chopped into tiny dark squares. The building was closing its eyes. To understand why the screens failed, we must first look at the engineering logic. The theory was sound. A Faraday cage works by distributing an electrical charge around the exterior of a conductive mesh, cancelling out the field inside. If the holes in the mesh are smaller than the wavelength of the radiation cannot pass through. The Moscow signal was 2.5 GHz. The wavelength was approximately 12 centimeters. The mesh holes were tiny, only a few millimeters. On paper, it was perfect. The microwave should have hit the screen and reflected back into the street, like water hitting a solid wall. The State Department spent millions of dollars on this project. They shipped the special aluminum from the United States. They brought in cleared American contractors to install it, fearing that Soviet workers would sabotage the grid. It was a massive, visible admission of guilt. For years, the US had denied the signal existed. Now, they were wrapping their building in armor to stop it. The sight of the embassy covered in black mesh became a symbol of the siege. To the Russians walking by on the street, it looked like the Americans were building a zoo cage. But inside, the staff felt a momentary relief. They saw the screens going up. They saw the do not warn protocol finally giving way to action. They thought, finally, we are safe. They were wrong. The failure of the screens was not in the mesh itself, but in the gaps. A building is not a solid box. It has seam, it has window frames, it has air vents, it has doors that open and close. Microwaves behave like water. If there is a crack, they will find it. This is a phenomenon known as diffraction. When a wave hits a barrier with a small opening, it doesn't just stop. It bends around the edge and squeezes through. The technicians monitoring the signal inside the embassy noticed something disturbing. When the screens went up, the signal dropped, but only by about 90%. That sounds like a success. But in the world of biology, 10% of a harmful signal is still harmful, especially when you are exposed to it for years. But furthermore, the screens created hotspots. The signal that did get through bounced around inside the room. Before the screens, the waves could pass through the window, hit the back wall, and scatter. Now, with the metal mesh on the windows, the waves that leaked in were trapped. They reflected off the metal filing cabinets, off the steel desks, and are on the back of the aluminum screens themselves. Office became a microwave reverberation chamber. In some specific spots like the corner of a secretary's desk, the interference patterns actually amplified the signal. The protection had created focused pockets of high-intensity radiation. The staff standing in these pockets were absorbing more energy than before. The other failure of the screens was that they assumed the enemy was static. They assumed the Soviets would just keep firing the same beam at the same power and give up when it was blocked. This was a naive underestimation of Soviet engineering. When the KGB saw the screens going up, they didn't turn off the machine, they turned it up. The Moscow signal power levels recorded in late 1976 show a massive spike. The Soviets simply increased the output of their mesh. They brute forced the signal through the mesh. They also changed the frequency. A mesh designed to block 2.5 GHz might be transparent to 5 GHz. By shifting the wavelength, the Soviets could render the millions of dollars of aluminum useless in an instant, and it became a game of cat and mouse. We put up a screen, they changed the channel. We added a second layer, they boosted the power. The only losers in this game were the people sitting behind the glass. They were the biological sensors in an electronic war. They could feel the difference. Staff reported that after the screens were installed, the hum in their heads changed pitch. The headaches didn't go away, they just became sharper. The Moscow fog didn't lift, it became denser. We must also consider the psychological cost of the screens. Moscow is a dark city. The winter lasts for 6 months. The sun rises at 9 a.m. and sets at 3 p.m. Light is a precious commodity. The aluminum mesh blocked 50% of the visible light. It turned the embassy offices into twilight zones. Even at noon, the rooms were dim and gray. The psychological impact of living in a cage cannot be overstated. The staff felt imprisoned. They felt cut off from the world. The view they had loved, the connection to the city, was gone. They were working in a bunker. This lack of light contributed to the depression and fatigue that the signal was already causing. It was a synergistic attack. The weapon made them tired, and the defense made them sad. The diaries from this period are filled with descriptions of the gloom. People dreaded going to work. The building felt oppressive, heavy, and dead. The screens were a physical manifestation of the paranoia that had consumed the mission. Let's look closer at the distillation itself. The devil is in the details. The screens were attached to the exterior window frames, but the frames themselves were often made of wood or old masonry. Microwaves pass through wood as if it isn't there. The engineers realized too late that they had shielded the glass, but they hadn't shielded the frames. The beam was simply going around the aluminum dot. It was like building a waterproof door but leaving a gap at the bottom. The water still comes in. To fix this, they tried to seal the frames with conductive tape and metal stripping. It was a patchwork job, a desperate attempt to plug the leaks. But every time a window was opened to let in fresh air, which was necessary, because the ventilation system was old, the shield was broken. Staff were caught in a dilemma: suffocate in stale, hot air, or open the window and let the radiation in. Most chose the air, and the beam followed. The failure of the defense wasn't limited to the Chancery office building. It extended to the ambassador's residence, the Spaso house. This was a grand, historic mansion where the ambassador lived. It was miles away from the main embassy. For years, they thought Spaso house was safe. It wasn't in the line of sight of the balcony. But in 1977, the technicians did a sweep of the residence. They found the signal there too. The Soviets were not just targeting one building, they were targeting the people. When the ambassador went home, the signal followed him. They had set up a second transmitter near the residence. The idea of screening Spaso house was impossible. It was an architectural treasure. You couldn't wrap a ballroom in aluminum mesh, so the ambassador slept unprotected. This revelation shattered the illusion of the aluminum shield. It proved that you couldn't engineer your way out of the problem. As long as the Soviets wanted to irradiate you, they would find a way. The screens were just theater. They were a prop designed to make the staff feel like the government was doing something, when in reality, the government was out of ideas. Imagine standing in an office in 1978. You look out through the black mesh. The world looks pixelated, broken into tiny grid squares. You hold a field strength meter near the window. It clicks. Click ... click ... click ... It is slower than before, but it is still there. You move the meter to the crack between the window and the wall. The clicking speeds up. BZZT, a hotspot. You realize that the invisible water is trickling in. You realize that the cage isn't keeping the monster out. It's just changing the shape of the attack. The ultimate proof of the failure was in the blood. If the screens worked, The white blood cell counts of the staff should have returned to normal. The mutations should have stopped. They didn't. Medical reports from 1977 and 1978 after the installation show that the lymphocytosis persisted. The staff was still getting sick. The Moscow fog was still descending. This was a devastating blow to the State Department. They had played their ace card, the Faraday Cajone. They had lost. They had nowhere left to hide. The failure of the screens forced a change in strategy. They couldn't block the signal. They couldn't ignore the signal. They had to stop the signal at the source. But stopping the source meant confrontation. It meant admitting to the world that the screens were a failure. It meant admitting that the US government had spent millions on a useless metal blanket. There is a final, chilling detail about the screen era. When the screens went up, the signal didn't just get stronger. It got more complex. The analysts noticed that the modulation patterns became more erratic. It was as if the Soviets were testing the screens, probing for weaknesses. They started using burst transmissions, short, high-power blasts that could penetrate the mesh, before the sensors could even register them. The balcony had become a sentient enemy. It was adapting. This adaptation suggests that the Soviets were enjoying the game. They watched the Americans scurry around on scaffolds, hanging wire. They watched them build their cage, and then they simply adjusted a dial and laughed. It was a humiliation of American engineering. The aluminum screens stand today in the memory of the Cold War as a monument to futility. They were ugly. They were expensive, and they didn't work, but they did accomplish one thing. They made the secret visible, before the screens. The Moscow signal was invisible, a rumor, a ghost. After the screens, it was a physical reality. You couldn't deny the signal when the entire building was wearing a mask to stop it. Journalists visiting Moscow saw the black mesh. They asked questions. Why are the windows covered? Why does the embassy look like a prison? The limited hangout excuses. It's for security. It's to stop glass from shattering. Didn't hold up. The screens drew attention to the very thing they were supposed to hide. And in Boston, a reporter named Fred Pillsbury was starting to put the pieces together. He had sources. He had medical leaks. And now, he had visual confirmation that the US embassy was under siege. The screens were the final straw. The barrier was about to break. Not the aluminum barrier, but the barrier of silence. The file we open next is the one the government feared the most. It is not a classified memo. It is a newspaper headline. The cage is broken. The beam is leaking in, and tomorrow morning, the whole world is going to know why. A secret is like a pressurized container. You can seal it with stamps, you can lock it in a vault, and you can guard it with men in suits. But physics dictates that pressure seeks a release. The more people involved in a conspiracy, the thinner the walls of the container become. For 23 years, the secret of the Moscow signal held. It survived the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, and the fall of Nixon. But in February 1976, the seal finally broke. It didn't break because of a Soviet defector. It didn't break because of a congressional hearing. It broke because of a phone call to a newspaper in Boston. The leak was the moment the timeline split. Before 1976, the diplomats in Moscow were suffering in silence, victims of an invisible gaslight. After 1976, they were victims of a public betrayal. The headline that ran in the Boston Globe did more damage to the State Department's reputation than any Soviet spy ring ever could. It revealed that the enemy wasn't just the machine across the street. It was the silence of their own superiors. The file we open tonight is not a government memo. It is the first draft of history, written in ink on newsprint, exposing a cover-up that had spanned 3 decades. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The sound of 1976 is mechanical. It is the heavy clack of typewriter keys striking paper. It is the smell of hot lead and ink in a printing press. In a newsroom in Boston, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and coffee. A reporter sits at a metal desk, holding a receiver to his ear. On the other end of the line is a voice novice hesitant, whispering details that sound like science fiction. Microwaves, sickness, a cover-up. The reporter writes it down. He doesn't know it yet, but he is writing the obituary of the Do Not Warn protocol. The reporter's name was Fred Pillsbury. He was not a spy hunter. He was a journalist for the Boston Globe, but in the ecosystem of secrets. Sometimes the outsider sees what the insiders ignore. Pillsbury had sources. The exact identity of the deep throat for the Moscow signal remains a subject of debate in the archival community. Some say it was a disgruntled medical officer. Others say it was a diplomat who had watched his friend die. Whatever the source, the information was precise. They didn't just tell Pillsbury that the embassy was being irradiated. They told him about the blood counts. They told him about the aluminum screens. They told him about the Moscow fog. Pillsbury realized he was sitting on a bombshell. But publishing a story like this in 1976 was dangerous. The Cold War was a delicate balance. The government argued that releasing this information would harm national security. They used the classic defense: if we print this, the Soviets will know we know. But Pillsbury argued the counterpoint: the Soviets already know. The only people who don't know are the Americans living in the building. On February 7, 1976, the Boston Globe ran the story. The headline was stark. It didn't use euphemisms. It laid out the facts. The US Embassy in Moscow was being bombarded by microwave radiation. The staff were getting sick, and the State Department had known about it for years. News travels fast, even before the internet. The Globe story was picked up by the wire services AP, UPI, Reuters. Within hours, it was being read in London, Paris, and Washington. And in Moscow. Imagine the scene in the embassy cafeteria on that morning. The newspapers arrived in the diplomatic pouch. A staff member unfolds the paper. He reads the headline. The silence in the room breaks. For the staff, this wasn't news. It was validation. Suddenly, the headaches made sense. The fatigue made sense. The metallic taste in the water made sense. It was a moment of collective realization. We aren't crazy. We are targets. But that realization was quickly followed by rage. They looked at their superiors, the station chief, the ambassador who, as we know, was also a victim, and they asked the hard questions. How long have you known? Why didn't you tell us? The trust that holds a diplomatic mission together evaporated instantly. The embassy became a house of suspicion. Every order from Washington was now viewed through a lens of betrayal. The archive chill here is palpable. It is the feeling of realizing that the people sworn to protect you have been using you as bait. In Washington, the reaction was panic. Henry Kissinger, the master of control, had lost control of the narrative. The phone lines at the State Department melted down. Families of the embassy staff were calling, demanding to know if their husbands and wives were safe. Congressmen were calling, demanding hearings. Kissinger's strategy of containment had failed. Now he had to move to damage control. The declassified transcripts of the meetings from that week show a government in chaos. They couldn't deny the signal existed anymore. The aluminum screens on the windows made that impossible. So, they tried to deny the danger. They rolled out the scientific uncertainty defense. They issued statements saying, yes, there is a signal, but it is very weak. It is far below the safety standards for a microwave oven. There is no proof of any health effects. This was a technically true lie. The safety standards for a microwave oven are based on thermal heat. The Moscow signal was a thermo. It didn't cook. It disrupted. By using the oven standard, the government could claim the beam was safe, even as the blood of their employees was mutating. It was a cynical manipulation of science to calm the public. The State Department held a press briefing. A spokesman stood at a podium, sweating under the hot lights. We are monitoring the situation, he said. The health of our staff is our top priority. The journalists in the room scribbled in their note. They knew it was a hollow phrase. If health was the priority, why were the screens only installed after the leak? Why were the medical files classified? The press began to dig. They found out about the hazard pay. They found out about the lifestyle differential bonus given to Moscow staff. They realized the government had been paying the diplomats danger money to sit in the beam. Without telling them what the danger was, it was blood money. And what of the Soviets? How did the authors of the signal react to the leak? They did what they always did. They denied everything. The Soviet Foreign Ministry issued a statement calling the Boston Globe story a capitalist fabrication. They claimed there was no beam. They claimed the Americans were hallucinating. But then, they pivoted. When confronted with the technical data, the frequency, the power levels, the Soviets changed their story. They said, yes, there are some signals, but they are not directed at the embassy. They are industrial signals. Or perhaps they are used to jam American spies. They tried to turn the tables. They claimed the Americans were the ones listening, and the beam was just a defensive measure to stop the US from spying on Moscow. This was a clever piece of geopolitical judo. It forced the US to admit that they were spying from the embassy, which they were, in order to complain about the jamming. The leak had turned the secret war into a public circus, but the Soviets didn't turn off the machine. In fact, as we saw with the aluminum screens, they turned it up. The leak emboldened them. They realized the US government was more afraid of a scandal than a confrontation. They realized Kissinger wouldn't retaliate. So, the beam stayed on. The humiliation continued. Inside the embassy, the atmosphere was poisonous. The staff formed a committee. They demanded independent medical testing. They didn't trust the State Department doctors anymore. They wanted doctors from Johns Hopkins or Harvard, civilians who weren't on the government payroll. The demand led to the famous Lilienfeld study, a massive epidemiological review of the embassy staff. But even this victory was hollow. The study took years, and while it was being conducted, the staff still had to go to work. They had to walk into the building every day, knowing exactly what was happening. Imagine the psychological toll. You read the newspaper, it says you are being microwaved. You look out the window, you see the balcony, you feel the headaches starting, and you have to sit down and type a memo about grain exports. Many staff members requested transfers. The Moscow Post, once a career maker, became a who would bring their children to a radioactive house. The State Department had to increase the salary, increase the vacation time, and shorten the tour of duty just to get people to sign up. Moscow became a hardship post, not because of the cold, but because of the beam. The leak triggered an exodus. Wives packed up their children and left. The compound became a bachelor pad of lonely, irradiated men. The school and the embassy emptied out. The playground was quiet. The community was broken, and in the silence of the empty apartments, the hum of the 2.5 GHz signal seemed louder than ever. The leak hadn't stopped the weapon. It had just cleared the target area of the innocent, leaving only the professionals to absorb the fire. There was one group for whom the leak was a victory. The security technicians. For 20 years, these men had been screaming into the void. They were the ones measuring the beam. They were the ones writing the reports that went into the shredder. When the story broke, they felt a grim satisfaction. We told you, they whispered in the secure vaults. We told you in 1953. We told you in 1960. We told you in 1975. The leak proved that the technical data was right, and the political policy was wrong. It validated the science of the archive chill. It proved that the invisible world is real, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away. But vindication doesn't cure cancer. The technicians, who spent the most time in the direct line of fire measuring the signal, were some of the sickest. The 1976 leak was the climax of the Moscow signal story, but it was not the end. The controversy raged for a few years, and then, like all news cycles, it faded. The public moved on. The screens became part of the scenery. The staff learned to live with the risk, but the biology didn't move on. The mutations in the blood continued. The slow-motion deaths of the ambassadors continued. And the technology didn't stop. The leak told the world that it was happening, but it didn't explain how. It didn't explain the mind control theories. It didn't explain the Project Pandora experiments. Those files remained locked. The 1976 leak was a crack in the dam, but the reservoir of secrets was deep. Today, looking back at that newspaper clipping, we see it as a warning that was ignored. The world read the story, gasped, and then forgot. But the signal didn't forget us. The frequencies, developed in Moscow in the 1970s, evolved. They became smaller, smarter, and more portable. The Moscow signal became the grandfather of a new generation of invisible weapons. And 50 years later, in a hotel room in Havana, and a house in Guangzhou, and an office in Washington, the signal returned. The final file we open tonight connects the dots. It proves that the archive chill is not history. It is current events. The leak revealed the prototype, but the weapon has been perfected. The headache is back, and this time, it's global. History does not repeat itself, but it echoes. A ghost story is scary because the ghost returns. A conspiracy is terrifying because the mechanism of the lie remains, even after the original liars are dead. For 60 years, the file on the Moscow signal was treated as a historical curiosity, a relic of the Cold War. A strange anomaly involving vacuum tubes and spies in trench coats. We believed that when the Berlin Wall fell, the signal turned off. We believed the balcony across the street was empty. But in late 2016, in the tropical heat of Havana, Cuba, the ghost returned. It didn't wear a trench coat. It wore the disguise of the modern world. American diplomats, sitting in their homes, heard a sound. It wasn't the low hum of 1953. It was a high-pitched, piercing shriek. It was a sound that followed them from room to room. It was a sound that brought with it the pressure, the fog, and the brain damage that we now recognize as the signature of an invisible war. The Moscow signal was not a one-time event. It was a prototype. It was the version 1.0 of a weapon that has now been refined, miniaturized, and deployed globally. The file we close tonight is not about the past. It is about the present. It connects the radiation of the 1950s to the headlines of today. proving that the experiment never ended, it just expanded. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The air in the archive is cold, recycled, and smells of ozone. We are standing at the end of a long aisle of steel shelves. The paper files of the 1950s yellowed, brittle, smelling of dust give way to the sleek, black servers of the modern era. The blue light of the data drives flickers in the dark. The ink has faded, but the digital code is fresh. We are no longer looking at typewritten memos. We are looking at encrypted emails and MRI scans. The medium has changed, but the message is the same. Someone is listening, and someone is firing. To understand the ending of this story, we must travel to the Hotel Nacional in Havana. It is a grand, historic building overlooking the ocean. In 2016 and 2017, American intelligence officers and diplomats began to report a phenomenon that defied explanation. They called it the sound. Witnesses described it as a grinding metal noise, or a piercing insect buzz. But unlike normal sound, it was directional. If you stepped to the left, it stopped. If you stepped to the right, it returned. It was a beam of acoustic energy, focused like a laser. And then came the symptoms. The same symptoms we saw in the Moscow fog. The crushing fatigue, the inability to concentrate, the sudden loss of memory. But this time, the symptoms were more violent. Diplomats suffered from vertigo so severe they couldn't walk. They suffered from hearing loss. They suffered from what doctors later called the immaculate concussion, traumatic brain injury without a blow to the head. The medical charts of the Havana victims looked terrifyingly similar to the medical charts of the Moscow embassy staff from the 1960s. The same white blood cell fluctuations, the same neurological gaps. The archive chill sets in when you realize that the doctors in 2017 were baffled, just as the doctors in 1960 were baffled. They didn't know what they were looking at, because the history had been hidden from them. If the files on the Moscow signal had been public, if the do not warn protocol had never existed, the doctors in Havana would have recognized the weapon immediately. They would have said, "This is the signal. It's back." But because the Moscow data was buried in the shadow copy files, a new generation of Americans had to learn the hard way. They had to be the new guinea pigs in an experiment that had already been run on in 2020. The National Academy of Sciences finally released a report on the Havana Syndrome. Their conclusion was a vindication of every technician who stood in the window in Moscow. They determined that the most likely cause of the injury was directed pulsed radio frequency energy. Pulsed radio frequency. This is the exact same technology as the Moscow signal. It is the same 2.5 to 4.0 GHz range, but modulated with modern sophistication. The Moscow signal was a blunt instrument. It was a floodlight. It washed the whole building in radiation. The Havana weapon is a scalpel. It is a sniper rifle. It can target a specific room, perhaps even a specific person, without affecting the neighbor. This evolution mirrors the technological progress of the last 50 years. We went from broadcast TV to fiber optics. The weapon went from a balcony-sized generator to a portable device that can fit in a van or a suitcase. The fray effect, the microwave hearing we discussed in the Project Pandora files, is the key. The high-pitched sound the diplomats heard in Havana wasn't sound waves moving air. It was microwaves boiling the water inside their cochlea. They were hearing the decricity, but the story doesn't stay in Cuba. Just as the Moscow signal followed Ambassador Stossel home, the Havana Syndrome has gone global. Reports have come in from China, from Russia, from Vienna, even from Washington, D.C., near the White House. The anomaly is no longer confined to a single hostile capital. It is moving. This creates a modern paranoia that is far deeper than the Cold War dread. In 1960, you knew where the danger was. It was in the embassy. You could leave. Today, the danger is mobile. It is invisible. It can be anywhere. This is the ultimate fulfillment of the Project Pandora research. Remember Richard Cesaro, the man who wanted to know if you could beam confusion into a crowd? The Havana Syndrome proves that you can. You can disable a spy, a diplomat, or a leader without leaving a trace. You can make them sick, make them retire, make them doubt their own sanity. It is the perfect gray zone weapon. It exists below the threshold of war. It creates injury, but not death. It creates fear, but not proof. And just like in Moscow, the government's response has been slow, confused, and filled with denial. Imagine sitting in your apartment tonight. You hear a ringing in your ears. Is it tinnitus? Is it the refrigerator? Or is it the lock? The psychological terror of this weapon is that it weaponizes the environment. It makes silence suspicious. The Moscow diplomats looked at the balcony and wondered. We look at the cell tower. We look at the Wi-Fi router. We look at the van parked down the street. The archive chill is the realization that the air around us is not empty. It is crowded with frequencies, and some of those frequencies carry intent. The parallel between Moscow and Havana is not just in the technology, it is in the bureaucracy. In 2017, the State Department told the Havana victims, it's mass hysteria, it's the sound of crickets, it's stress. This is the exact same script used by Dr. Herbert Pollack in 1965. It's the Moscow virus. It's cabin fever. The government gaslit its own people again. Why? Because acknowledging the weapon is politically inconvenient. If the US admits that Russia or another power is using directed energy weapons on American soil, they have to respond. It is an act of war, but the US doesn't want war. They want stability. They want trade. So, just like Henry Kissinger sacrificed the bone marrow of the Moscow staff to save data, the modern State Department sacrificed the brains of the Havana diplomats to save the status quo. The Do Not Warn protocol is still active. It just has a different name. The victims in Havana had to fight for years to get medical care. They had to go to the press, just like the Moscow staff did in 1976. They had to leak their own medical records too, prove they weren't crazy. The cycle of history is a perfect circle. The weapon changes, but the silence remains the same. That as we close this investigation, we must reflect on what the Moscow signal actually represents. That it represents the end of privacy, not the privacy of your emails or your phone calls, the privacy of your biology, the privacy of your mind. For thousands of years, the human body was a fortress. To hurt you, an enemy had to touch you. They had to hit you with a sword, a bullet, or a fist. The Moscow signal breached that fortress. It proved that you can be touched from a distance. You can be altered from across the street. The aluminum screens failed because you cannot screen out the world. We live in an ocean of electromagnetic waves. We rely on them for our phones, our GPS, our news. We cannot build a Faraday cage around our lives. This leaves us vulnerable in a way that is uniquely modern. We are open systems. Our nerves are antennas. Our DNA is a receiver. The archive chill is the feeling of that vulnerability. It is the knowledge that the walls of your house are transparent to the right frequency. Let us look back one last time at the beige apartment building on Makovaya Street in Moscow. The balcony is still there. The wooden slats are gone. The apartment is likely empty, or occupied by a family who knows nothing of the machine that once sat there. But the legacy of that machine is everywhere. It is in the medical textbooks describing microwave hearing. It is in the crowd control trucks used by police departments. It is in the classified labs where the next generation of non-lethal weapons is being designed. The signal was never turned off. It was just dispersed. It was integrated into the background noise of the 21st century. We must remember the names. Walter, the cipher clerks, the secretaries, the young Marines, the children who grew up with leukemia. They were the pioneers of this invisible frontier. They walked into the beam so that we could understand what it does. That their suffering provided the data points that allow us to understand the Havana Syndrome today. Their blood is the ink in the safety manuals. They were the casualties of a silent war, buried without honors, their injuries denied by the flag they served. We tell their story tonight, not to solve the crime. The crime is 50 years old and the perpetrators are dead, but to acknowledge the wound. To open the file is to witness the truth, and witnessing is a form of justice. Voice cue, prepare for the outro. The tone becomes soft, heavy, and final. The pacing slows down significantly. The investigation into the Moscow signal is a journey into the darkest part of the government psyche. It reveals a world where human beings are components, where health is a liability, and where the truth is the most classified secret of all. We have seen the anomalies. We have triangulated the source. We have analyzed the blood. We have heard the silence. The puzzle is complete. The beam was real. The danger was real. The betrayal was real. And somewhere, in a quiet room, a machine is humming. A needle is twitching. A frequency is being dialed in. The experiment continues, but our part in it is done. That we have walked through the snow of 1953. We have stood in the cold labs of Project Pandora. We have sat in the darkened rooms behind the aluminum screens. The story of the Moscow signal is a reminder that the world is stranger, colder, and more complex than we are told. It teaches us to listen to the background noise, to question the fog, to trust our own senses when the official story tells us we are wrong. But now, the investigation is over. The evidence has been presented. The witnesses have spoken. The archive must be secured. The lights in the vault are dimming. The dust is settling on the shelves. You have heard the truth about the invisible siege. You carry the secret now. Let the static fade. Let the frequency drop. Let the silence return to the room. The hum is gone. The air is still. You are safe. Sleep now. The file is closed.